Okay. I think we are ready to begin, ladies and gentlemen of the committee and ladies and gentlemen of the public who are here with us. We have quorum, and I will, as a result, call together the meeting of the 8th meeting of the Executive Committee and call the meeting to order. We acknowledge the land we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. For members of the public, they can watch us on YouTube at Toronto City Council Live or follow the meeting on their computer, tablet, or smartphone at www.toronto.ca/council. I will first ask the members of the committee if there are any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. If so, please indicate the item number and the nature of the interest. Any declarations of interest this morning? All right, seeing none, we can move on. May I ask first for a motion to confirm the minutes of the Executive Committee held on July 4th, 2019. Moved by Councillor Ainslie. All those in favour? And we have to sort of show that beautiful September Day energy of putting your hand up to say you're in favour. Opposed? Carried. Thank you. I would like to add an item of new business, and it's entitled Investing in Community-Based Anti-Violence Programs. I think you have the item before you on pink paper, and it really is just to make sure that when we come to Council, we can have some additional advice beyond the discussion that was led by Councillor Carroll at the Budget Committee with respect to some things we might do to make some additional investments in anti-violence programs, and we'll get to it. But may I have your concurrence with adding it to the agenda for now? All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. We have 26 items on the agenda. Before we begin running through them, may I ask that you would agree to take the 3 items that pertain to Toronto Community Housing Corporation, namely EX 8.4, Toronto Community Housing Corporation mortgage renewal, EX 8.8 federal funding for Toronto Community Housing capital repairs, and EX 8.11 sustainable energy plan financing program supporting Toronto Community Housing Corporation transform TO and resiliency, that we would consider those together and consider them as the first 3 items of business today. This is in the interest of having executives from the Toronto Community Housing Corporation here and devoting as little time as possible to this so they can get back to implementing these things and other things that they're working on. Are people favorably disposed to ordering the agenda in that manner? All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. So I think that puts us in a position where we can now proceed with the rundown of the items, and so we'll go through. EX 8.1, item EX 8.1, transfer payment agreement for Provincial Audit and Accountability Fund grant. Moved by Councillor Deputy Mayor Menon-Wong. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Item EX 8.2, Development Charges Complaints, Delegation of Hearing Authority under the Education Act and the Development Charges Act. Is there a mover for that? Moved by Councillor Ainslie. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Item EX 8. Sorry, I skipped over 3. Where's 3? There it is. 3 is City of Toronto Investment Report for 2018 and first quarter of 2019 and policy update. Somebody prepared to move that receipt of that report? Moved by Councillor Crawford. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Item EX 8.4. We're going to. We can see if there's other. Is there anybody wishing to hold that? Is that being held by Councillor Bailão? Are you holding 8.4, Deputy Mayor? Yes. The mortgage renewal? Oh, no. No, you're prepared to move it? Okay. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried.
Mr. Chair, just
I'm sorry, Councillor Thompson, Deputy Mayor.
You had indicated that 8.4, 8.8, and 8.11 would all be dealt with together.
Yes.
There was a speaker on 8.8, so should we not hold?
I think what we would do though is have that speaker speak to the 8.8 part of this when we deal with 8.4, 8.8, and 8.11. So we'll still do that, but it means 8.4 is now would be deemed as carried, because there are no speakers and no comments from here. So I think we'll deal with them together, but we'll deal with what's left to be dealt with, which will include that one.
I understand that, but in the nature of things that we've seen in the past, that things do come up when we say that we're going to deal with things all together. That's just.
Well, we can hold down 8.4 just in case.
Together.
Yep. Okay. Fair enough. So we'll hold down 8.4 because we're dealing with those 3 together. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. EX 8.5. Bill 148, minimum wage, local 79 recreation part-time unit wage schedule. This is a consequence of the provincial legislation. Moved by Councillor Ainslie. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. 8.6, EX 8.6, fostering diversity in the Toronto Public Service. And this is seeking our recommendation to Council to endorse the Workforce Equity and Inclusion Plan outlined in the report. Is there a mover for that report? Moved by Deputy Mayor Thompson. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Item 8.7 is being held for deputations. Item 8.8 is being held for a deputation and fits into what Deputy Mayor Thompson was referring to earlier, which is we'll keep those all together. Item 8.9 is being held for deputations, EX 8.9. Item EX 8.10, Toronto Water 2019 capital budget and 2028 capital plan adjustments. Moved by Councillor Crawford. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Item EX 8.11 is one of the ones being dealt with as part of the TCHC group, and so we'll leave that, hold that down until we deal with the three together. Item EX 8.12, 2018 Development Charge Reserve Fund Statement. Moved by Councillor Crawford. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Item EX 8.13, Capital Variance Report for the 6-month period ended June 30th, 2019. Motion from Councillor Crawford to receive the report. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Item EX 8.14, Operating Variance Report for the 6-month period ended June 30th, 2019. I have no deputations on that. I may have a motion to, let's see, what are we doing? Recommending to the Executive Committee that we approve certain transfers and so forth. It's for basically housekeeping. Moved by Councillor Crawford. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Item EX 8.15, Reserve and Reserve Fund Balances Report, June 30th, 2019. Moved by Councillor Crawford. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Item EX 8.16, Information and Technology, 2019 to 2028 Capital Plan Adjustments and Accelerations Deferrals.
I'd like to hold it, please.
You'd like to hold that? Councillor Ainslie will hold 8.16. 8.17, Project Cost Adjustments and Deferrals, Acceleration to the Parks, Forestry and Recreation 2019 Capital Budget and Adjustments to the 2028 Capital Plan. Moved by Councillor Nunziata. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Item EX 8.18, Solid Waste Management Services 2019 Capital Budget and 2028 Capital Plan Adjustments coming from the Budget Committee, and there's some authorization of reallocations being recommended to Council by us. Are you moving that, Councillor Crawford? Moved by Councillor Crawford. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Item EX 8.20, additional funding to support Toronto Police Services is being held for deputations. EX 8.21, items considered by the Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee 2014 to 2018 term is being held for a deputation. Item EX 8.22, proposed budget process changes to remove systemic barriers to hiring people with disabilities.
Quick amendment to that, if I could.
Yes, fine.
It's just to change the exempt to a request for consideration as part of the 2020 budget process.
So it changes, I'm sorry, just again so people understand.
Change is to exempt, to actually exempt it. It's just to send it off to budget for
I see
consideration.
here, yes, I see it, I see the wording, okay. All right, so there's the wording in front of you on the screen. Councillor Crawford has moved an amendment and moved the motion as amendment. All in favor of the amendment? Did you want, were you voting for it? Yeah. Okay, vote for the amendment, and then on the item, all those in favor? Carry. EX 28.23, Wheel-Trans appeal process. This is some requests that we would make through City Council to the TTC. May I have someone to move that? Moved by Deputy Mayor Thompson. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Item EX 8.24, accessibility and safety at the Toronto Raptors Parade and Rally. Again, this is a letter from the Accessibility Advisory Committee, and it has us giving some direction to the city manager on accessibility issues being reviewed together with all the other things that are being reviewed on parades. May I have a mover of that? Moved by Deputy Mayor Barlow. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Item EX 8.25, request to explore the feasibility of a public event in recognition of International Day of People with Disabilities on December 3rd, 2019. And this is us asking the Chief People Officer, People and Equity, to explore the feasibility of a public event, moved by Deputy, I'm sorry. Hold it.
I'll move it with a small amendment that I've asked. The staff will need a little bit more time, so I'm changing.
Okay, so
my
we'll hold
number
that down.
four.
Thank you very much.
I can move it. It's ready, the motion, Mayor, if you want to.
Oh, it
do
is
that as a
ready?
quick- Yep.
Oh, fine, okay, if it's ready, then let's,
Yeah.
can we put it up, the amendment that we're looking at here? There we are, and so it's just really changed the date, is that all that's changed?
Yep.
Okay. So Deputy Mayor Barlow has moved the recommendation as amended simply to change the date to November 1st, 2019, and she's moved that. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. And then we'll hold down again, Councillor Kerr, were you here specifically to speak to this anti-violence thing? Because I'm happy to, if you've come all this
Well, I
way.
have a couple of items.
Okay,
Yeah, but I would like to speak to that when the time comes.
all right, well, in that case, we'll just hold it down and deal with it
You know, yeah.
later on. Sorry, to consider.
This one together with you.
Oh, yes, can I have your concurrence to consider that item, the new item of business, together with 8.20, which is the funding for the police, so we can then deal with that as one, because they're essentially joined, they're the same issues. All those in favor of dealing with 8.20 and this one, which would become 8.26? So deal with those together when the time comes. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Okay. So, you'll have to help me now, Madam Clerk, as to what is the first item that we ended up after that rundown actually dealing with, which is,
Combination of 8.4, 8.3.
so, it's the housing items, of course, because we agreed to consider those first up. And so we would then, did any of those have deputations? Let me just pull that out here. Yes, so there were, so I guess what we should do first is deal with the deputation, of which there's only one on the three items to do that are being taken together. So let's hear that deputation, and then we'll get Mr. Marshman and anybody else that's appropriate to answer questions to staff. So Miguel, you're up on item 8.8, federal funding for Toronto Community Housing capital repairs.
Good morning.
Good morning, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Welcome to federal elections 2019, where politicians promise money. So $1.3 billion was promised in April of this year for Toronto community housing. What we're doing today is what we discussed at the board last week. Here's the item on the screen. Kevin is behind me and the staff of the community housing. We discussed this item, it was approved, but several people, it was a walking motion, by the way. This was a walking motion. Several people had decided to speak on this promise. Mr. Mayor, we in the city have four items of importance for the community. One of them is safety. We cannot be cheap with our residents when it comes to installation of CCTV cameras. Do you know that Phase 2 of Regent Park, they missed out installation of cameras on each floor versus Phase 3 of the revitalization? All of them have cameras. You hear me speaking of this matter at the Toronto Police Services Board. I took Councilor Michael Ford for a ride to 220 Oak, and 230 Sackville, and he saw the absence of cameras. I have a petition here. I have received verbal confirmation that 220 Oak finally is going to have cameras. I want to thank the leadership of TCAC for installing the cameras in the hallways at 220 Oak from the 28th to the second floor. But somehow there was a technical glitch, they tell me, that they didn't install the cameras on the staircases, on the stairwells, for the safety of members of EMS, first responders, and they also alleged that it was costly. So hopefully, with this promise of $1.3 million from the federal government, we will have cameras at Phase 2 of the revitalization, because we always speak about how magnificent is the revitalization, but underneath, under layers, there are problems, and they need to be addressed, put forward, because members of the community have not spoken about increasing Toronto police officer. They have spoken about CCTV cameras. So I want to ask the clerk to, I want to hand this over to the clerk. Can you please have it for the record? So that you have a copy of my petition for 220 Oak. And would you like to come here, or do you want me to go over there? It's scary to go over there because this is a security guard over there. And basically, I want to also suggest.
I won't let him lay a hand on you, Miguel, don't worry.
Okay, I want to suggest, why don't we put a city clerk on that end of the table? Because sometimes you walk in motion today that leads with Councilor Carroll. I want to have a hard copy, and it's scary to go through the security guard over there. And I wonder if you can have a city clerk where the officer of people is sitting right there, so we can have copies available of the speakers list, the agenda, et cetera, et cetera. That will facilitate the presence of security guard. We don't have any bad intentions anyway. So I think I spoke out of context here. But anyway, I hope that we can have those cameras at 220 Oak and phase 2, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and I will ask, when Mr. Marshman comes forward, we'll ask about that, just as, within the context of this item, since you've been
Okay.
taking the trouble to come here today. Thank you
I'm
very
gonna
much.
hang over my
Clerk will take
letter.
your petition. Thank you very much. Are there any questions of the deputant? Okay. All right, so that's the one and only deputation on those three items, and so if the committee's agreeable, then we'll ask thank you, Miguel. We'll ask Mr. Marshman to come forward, and with Ms. Penny and so I think it is sensible that we should sort of make sure we cover each of these items in terms of questions of staff, and we'll try and do it even though we're hearing them together one at a time. So that would mean first of the three items, I think, is 8.8. And, pardon me, 8.4. Just looking for my,
Yes, 8.4 is the renewal.
8.4 is the mortgage renewal, right. Okay, are there questions of staff, of Mr. Marshman or his associates or anybody else on item 8.4, the renewal of the Toronto Community Housing mortgage renewal on the properties? Questions of staff on that? Okay, then I'll move to questions of staff on EX 8.8, federal funding for Toronto Community Housing capital repairs. Well, I'll just have one because it really just feeds off, I'll put the clock on myself here. It feeds off Mr. Avarde's deputation. Maybe you could just discuss for a moment whether the criteria for the co-investment and the loans and grants that we're getting from CMHC allow sufficient flexibility to include in those things like cameras, or does that fall outside of this money, since that's technically what we're discussing here today is the federal money and receiving it?
I think our overall capital plan, irrespective of what the funding source is, certainly has room in it for cameras. And just, speaking to the specifics of 220 and other properties, we've made a commitment that we will conduct safety audits and implement cameras. And those safety audits, by the way, we conduct with residents and we discuss with Toronto Police Services to come up with a wholesome solution. One of the challenges we find actually in stairwells, and we're looking at how to overcome that, is the cameras are relatively low, so they can easily be vandalized, and no purpose in putting a camera in that obviously is not going to work more often than it is going to work. And so that's some of the things that we're looking at, and we're looking at solutions around that where we can still get the same effect, in terms of improving safety and security.
Has there been a concurrence as between the buildings that we've identified as ones where there's elevated levels of sometimes criminal activity and certainly socially disruptive behavior, and where we're looking at putting these cameras? In other words, are we taking the areas that are the subject matter of our safety program and looking at those first with these audits and making sure that we exhaust all positive opportunities to install cameras if
So yes, we've identified, 10 high-needs communities within our portfolio, and those are our primary areas. They also tend to be the ones we're looking at adding additional CSU officers in terms of hours of coverage and dedicated coverage. You heard us talk about that with regard to the Falstaff community, about a month ago, and we actually implemented that plan on September 5th. And there are other communities that we are rolling out this and next month.
Okay. And just one final question. If you found that you had significant numbers of places where it made sense to put cameras in, given what you said about them being vandalized and whatnot, is it possible, because I think it speaks to, what Miguel was deputing about, which is what we wouldn't want to have happen is if we couldn't spend the federal money, which we have in substantial quantity now, and it's meant for a whole bunch of things, is it possible, in your view, based on what you've read in terms of the criteria of that money, to use that for that purpose? Or is that, in your view, excluded so that we'd have to come up with the funds through our normal operating or capital budgets?
Okay. Yes, it is included. I've just confirmed with Sheila, who is
Oh.
intimately familiar with this.
Okay, those are my questions. We have two other people wishing to question. We'll start with Councillor Nunziata and then go to Deputy Mayor Barlow. Councillor Nunziata?
Yes, and thank you. We did do that safety audit at Falstaff, and I believe that it was very successful, and I believe we're having a second one. But just a question on, we identified a number of deficiencies in the increase in lighting when we went out for that audit. And as well is that I also had Toronto Hydro there to look at the increased lighting as far as the street level, because sometimes the lights on the street, you need to increase the lighting as well. So are we in those areas where we need to partner as well with Toronto Hydro, where they have to do an assessment of the street? Are we working with them to also increase the lighting and the security where it's abutting, where we have buildings like the Falstaff building?
Yes, I think that the general approach when we're looking at a property is we will look in terms of the lighting that we are responsible for, but we'll also have a perspective, and this is actually before we conduct the formal audit, Councillor. We'll have a perspective as to, do we need to engage the city, and in this case, Toronto Hydro, to work with us in terms of street lighting as well. So that's the long answer. The short answer is yes.
Right. And so once we have another date for the audit at Falstaff, but once that audit is complete, how long do we have to wait for the additional lighting and improvements around the buildings that we do complete the audit on?
I'm going to ask Sheila to speak to the timing because she's more familiar with the details of that, so I don't misstate.
So it depends on the scope of work that we're implementing. So we complete the audit, we agree on what we're going forward with, then we develop a project plan with timing, and we can share that with your office.
Okay.
But just as an overriding comment, this is a priority for us, so we would expedite it, to happen as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Just a question, the state of good repair. So the state of good repair is your capital projects that you're doing in our buildings. But when it comes to regular maintenance, for example, what happened at Falstaff a couple weeks ago where the tenant had a hole in the wall, there was a flood in the unit, and we went and just repaired it, but kept this big hole where there were cockroaches and so forth in the wall. Isn't that just part of the regular maintenance? Like, why would we have to wait until capital kicks in rather not do regular maintenance of a unit?
So I'll answer, it's a twofold. As I looked at the pictures, and certainly I'm not an engineer or an architect, so I'm just a regular guy looking at pictures, it looked like the risers in that building, when I looked at it once it was fixed, that the risers, were clearly old and, in need of replacement. So that's in the big capital repair program. Having a maintenance incident at your location should not take as long as it has historically taken. And part of our objective in the restructuring plan and moving that decision-making, shortening the time frame for approval, putting more authority and autonomy in the hands of the superintendent and their staffs are to get at that, to get a solution faster, Councillor.
Yes, well, I mean, we would put drywall on the wall rather than keep this big hole in the unit until, you do the capital.
I understand that.
Right, okay, thank
Right.
you.
Thanks, Councillor Anciata. Deputy Mayor Bylaw.
Thank you. From my recollection, looking at the last 10-year capital plan, this year, last year, next year was the highest FCI that we're going to have. So when can we expect to start having this curve coming down now that you have some stability on your funding?
Sure. It actually flattens out over the next couple of years and then starts to go down. Because what we've had, if you think about, the backlog, imagine a bucket, and there's a spigot on the bucket, and you pour water in, and that's the increased need of things to be replaced, and you turn the tap, and that's the capital repair that we spend. For the last number of years preceding this year, the inflow of water into that bucket has been at a faster rate than the outflow of us actually repairing buildings. And so as a result, the backlog continues to grow, the FCI continues to grow. And the FCI, for all councillors, is the Facilities Condition Index of a building. Our goal is to be at 10%. And over the plan, we will get to that goal, but it peaks in the next couple of years and then starts to come down, Councillor.
2021, we'll start seeing that. And this will continue to allow us to have the policy that no units are closing, and we're actually looking into reopening some of the ones that are closing, right?
That is correct.
Okay. Through the city manager.
Just to further add, that presumes that we pass the motion to support the federal funding initiative. It's a little 1.3
The city
billion.
manager, so one of the ways and one of prerequisites of this program is energy savings. So this is a program for affordable housing, but it's required that there's some energy savings as well. What is it going to be our lens as the guarantor of all this to ensure that throughout these years, the program is being implemented and the energy savings are being consuming? Is TCHC reporting to you or finance annually? Like what's going to be your lens to let us know that this is on track and we're going to be okay?
So if I can, probably the person best to speak to this is just walking to the mic right now. But I will add this, though, that the senior leadership of Toronto Community Housing and ourselves, myself in particular, meet on a monthly basis to kind of ensure that major priorities are being addressed. I mean, this 25% requirement would be something that we could certainly keep track of, but there's probably a better answer coming from.
But how do I guarantee that 5 years from now, TCHC is not asking for more money here because the energy savings that didn't occur? Like, what mechanisms are we as a city ensuring that we have and look into or a reporting structure to make sure that we are following that regularly, that we don't get any surprises?
So the answer to that is that the loan repayments are based upon the initial calculation of energy savings. Once that's set, the loan repayment is independent of actual energy saved. So there's no, that de-risks the issue of will there be underpayments down the road.
I will further search this because I'm not happy with this answer. But in terms of the procurement, I mean, a lot of money is being spent. So 300 million next year, 350 million. What are we as a city, as a guarantor for all these funds, are we having a look into in our audit plans, do we have anything forecasted to look into how this money is being spent, is being effective, so that we can go to our government partners and to our colleagues in here and saying, we feel secure, this is, we've taken these actions to guarantee that this is rolling out properly?
So if I can, I think I'm going to ask my CFO to respond to that question.
Through the chair. So through the budget process, we will be requesting all organizations from an agency perspective as well as city divisions to be identifying what are the key performance indicators and from a capital perspective, the key performance indicators are, one, where the value add is, what issues it addresses. The key performance indicators are an area of priority for us going into our 2020 budget process. So to specific to your question, we will in actual fact be looking, to your prior question, for indicators around the efficiency savings, as well as the intent of the money being spent and the business case supporting that request of funding.
If you wish, Councillor, I can provide some additional context to that. Just as in 2017, the city audited us. There were no major there were no major.
Specifically this program, or is it this program still in the program, in the?
Specifically the capital program and the procurement aspect of that. And there were no major deficiencies found in that, and any minor deficiencies, as I've just been advised by staff, have been rectified. So I just wanted to share that with you.
And that was the final question. I thank you for those questions. Are there any other members of the committee, Councillor Deputy Mayor Thompson? And okay, and
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, through you to the TCHC team. Can you give us a breakdown, please, with respect to the expenditure? It seems that a lot of calls that I get to my office, it's around the individual units in terms of the repairs that are needed in those units. Some cases where the kitchen, for example, has seen a tremendous, I would say, decline in terms of walls, ceiling, even doors, and even floors and bathrooms and things like that. Do you have a breakdown with respect to how you'll spend this fund? A lot of what I'm sort of gathering from what's here is facade, external repairs, and entrance and so on, but it doesn't address some of the more fundamental challenges in terms of people and place and space. So how will you utilize these funds to address some of those more fundamental issues?
Just, Councillor, thank you for that question. And I'm going to turn it over to Sheila to give you some more specifics. But just our general approach is to fix the most critical aspects of a building first. And certainly, so with regard to, if we have a choice to fix a roof or a suite, clearly we're going to fix the roof just because that has a greater impact. And so that's just I use that only as an example to show you that we've prioritized where the spending is. I'll turn it over to Sheila, and Sheila can answer your specifics around the in-suite repairs.
So it's an excellent question, and we do have, in parallel to making sure the roof is tight, the envelope, windows, we have a state of good repair program where we go into every unit and replace kitchens, bathrooms, and make repairs that are requested by the tenant to bring the unit back up to a state of good repair. And there is a significant annual investment in that, in the plan.
What is that number, the annual investment that you're spending?
In 2019, 13 million, 2020, 11, 2021, because we will have more windows, walls, envelopes tight, the number starts to rise, 15, and runs at 15 million, or is projected to run at 15 million for the balance of the plan.
And do you treat the scattered units similar in terms of addressing repairs and so on?
So the scattered houses?
Yes.
Are under the leadership of one manager who receives requests, funnels them through to us to go in and do repairs.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
thanks, Councillor Thompson. Councillor Pasternak.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I actually, since we're bundling these items, I have questions regarding to 811 and the installation of...
Councillor, what we were doing is just dealing with the repair item for questions first, just to get through those so they can be bundled, and then we'll move to 811. I know we're considering them all together, but just so that we don't move back and forth between topics.
All right.
Just hold
Well,
that
then
for 1 second.
I'll wait till this...
Just see if there's any other questions on the item to do with federal funding. Are there any others? Okay, well then, if there aren't, then please go ahead and ask your questions on the next item.
Well, that wasn't a long wait. So 39 buildings will receive a combined heat and power generator. I don't see an attached list of the buildings, of the locations. How was it decided on these 39? What were the criteria?
Through you, Mr. Chair, there were a number of criteria that were used to establish which buildings were looking at geographic spread across the portfolio, because these buildings will form a network of resiliency for our tenants. We looked at the capacity of the building to receive the system, the energy potential in the building. So there were a number of factors. We can provide the committee with the list. It's a fairly, in earlier board reports presented to our board, we mapped it. We can provide that coverage or that map to the committee.
Great. This is going to council, so if you could attach that as a supplementary report for October to council as a
We'll
staff
provide
undertaking.
it for
That
staff.
would be great.
Yep.
Now, the report goes on to say that these will not just service the building, but will these also be emergency community hubs?
Correct. So if we had another ice storm, we would have locations within our portfolio where we could shelter tenants.
Okay. And just by rough calculation, these pieces of equipment are $1.6 million each?
At a high level, yeah.
Yeah. And it went out through the normal procurement procedures, and it's your opinion that this is good value?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Pasternak. So we were, yes, Councillor Carroll.
Yeah, I'm sorry to ask you to go back out, but I
That's
wanted to-
okay.
this is a 11 specifically.
Not a problem.
I shared Councillor Pasternak's concerns, but I asked the procurement questions at Budget Committee. In terms of where you do the work, when we're dealing with the energy retrofit and projects of this nature, it's a little harder for you to say, let's spread it out between the 4 districts. Are the projects sort of evaluated based on whether the complex lends itself to the retrofit you're going to do?
Exactly.
That's really more the case here.
Yeah.
So you can't say one for me, one for you, one for you. You got to go with the best thing that lends itself to the project.
Correct.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I just wanted to know that before we see the list. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Carroll. Any other, then, I think that would be questions that are exhausted on all 3 of the items, but I'll just ask one more time. Is there anybody else who wants to ask any more questions of the staff on any of these 3, 8.4, 8.8, and 8.11? Okay, well, we will thank you very much for answering those questions. We could now move to speakers. Councillor Carroll, did you wish to speak?
Yes, on item number 8, I didn't ask any questions because I don't want to put anybody on the spot if it's not the case. But here's what I hope is the case. I hope that in doing the facilities indexing, looking for the key performance indicators of a project and where you spread this money, that what's added into deciding the condition of the facilities, that there's a social aspect added in. Because I think it's part of the problem where we have our more crime-ridden complexes. I have one, many councillors do. I have one where we've had 4 gunfire incidents in 12 months, and people are pretty traumatized. It's a complex where there is no key fob system and hasn't been for 10 years. The parking lot has many blind spots and is totally unsecured and would need major construction to do so. So probably won't be one of these projects. But if you're in a complex that looks like no one has cared for a long time and has no security, lots of easy ways in and out, and is just not laid out in a safe and secure way, it's a magic carpet ride in for the people that we work so hard to make sure are not in TCHC complexes. So I hope that the funds are grouped in such a way that, yes, we've got to do in-unit repair, because that's the final frontier that all the tenants are waiting for. And yes, we have some structural things we want to do. We have a separate fund to start to save on energy. But in prioritizing, all of these facilities are in rough shape. But the ones where the condition is now such that it's inviting those people in, I hope they'll be prioritized. Because to go in and say to the community, well, you got to really make a statement that you're on the ball and you are in the playground and you're going to own your community, they're not really feeling like doing that. And so I hope some priority is given to whatever is the social aspect of each complex in deciding how to prioritize urgent repairs. Thank you. Those are my comments.
Thanks, Councillor Carroll. Are there others wishing to speak? I beg pardon? We're on all, we can go through and do, we probably should do it that way, although it would be very efficient if people had comments that really were just on one, but could cover all three, and then we can, but I'll ask for speakers on 8.4, which is the mortgage renewal. Are there any speakers on that? Okay, and then we can next move to speakers on 8.8, which is the federal funding item. Did you want to speak on that, Deputy Mayor Barlow? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I just want to really thank everybody that has been working along the years, including you, Mayor. I think since day one that you came here, you took on this advocacy role with the federal government to really ask them to do what they're supposed to do, which is play their part in this issue. These are 110,000 residents that, with us, went all the way to Ottawa over the years and appealed to their MPs and advocacy days, and we had billboard campaigns, we had, you name it, over the years, and many people were turning to us and saying, just give it up, we're never going to get anything. And it is good to see that we did get the federal government to come to the table. This is really important because it's actually going to give this corporation, together with the work that we need to do as a city, the stability to have a robust 10-year plan. Having the largest landlord with thousands and thousands of units, a work plan of over $300 million to be rolled out, if you don't have the certainty of where the money is coming, it is very hard to do it efficiently and effectively and with the tenants in mind, most importantly. And by giving them the certainty, the rollout it will be much improved. The planning will be much improved. And so it's not only about getting the units fixed, it's actually getting the units fixed in the most effective, efficient way, and with the least impact to the tenants, or at least the least negative impact. We want it to have the positive impact. I know that TCHC is working as well to make sure that this trickles down to our community. I know that our staff is meeting with a lot of the tradespeople as well to make sure that some of this work is done actually by our tenants, by companies that are owned by our tenants, so that the effect is not only the money that is spent on these units, but actually some of the social impacts that can be had with having such a capital project. So I really want to thank everybody that has joined in calling on the federal government, and obviously giving credit to the federal government for realizing that this is an investment that has a huge ROI. When we started this campaign, we did an economic impact study, and the number of jobs that this creates, the number of savings that this creates, it is a win situation for any level of government that invests in here. We're not spending money, we're investing money, and most importantly, we're investing money in our communities and in our residents. So thank you for having that vision, and we hope that eventually we'll be able to celebrate having all three levels of government involved in this cause and in this project.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Are there others wishing to speak? Councillor Nunziata.
Yes, just briefly, and I agree with the councillor, and I'm pleased that the federal government has stepped up, and that we will be doing a lot of capital repairs in our buildings. It's about time. It's been years that we've been advocating, and my concern is, and I hope that we can, the individual units, because the majority of calls that I get in from tenants from my buildings are individual units where there's holes in the wall, things not being repaired. And so I hope we can focus on those, because those are real issues, and these are issues where tenants live and eat, And when they have a unit that's where it's full of mold and other issues, it's very difficult for them to live in these units. So that's really important to me as well. So, you know, I hope we can focus on those issues as well. For me, it's a priority. And the security issue with the security cameras, I'm very pleased on what's happened with our safety audit Falstaff, and thank you to the CO that attended my meeting, and I know we're moving forward. Tenants are very pleased on how we're proceeding with those issues at Falstaff, and looking forward to continue to work with in all our buildings on those issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Councilor Nunziata. Deputy Mayor Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And I want to thank the presenters for making their presentation this morning. And clearly, we are challenged with respect to housing in the City of Toronto. We're challenged with the fact that we are the largest landlord as it relates to ownership of these housing units and so on. And I recall the period where they were essentially downloaded to us, and it was great celebration that the expectation was there'd be resources associated with that celebration that would come along with it. Those resources really didn't come along, and we have seen a great decline with respect to many of the units, many of the buildings over the last 20 years or so. And in as much as we are working hard to try to respond to the complaints about the quality of the living environment for many of our residents, and we see the decline in the depreciation in terms of the structural assets, it is a huge problem. And inasmuch as we are providing funding to address this very problematic issue, I think there are a couple of things that we need to be mindful of. One, this is a place where people live, and inasmuch as the leadership of TCHC is working hard to address some of these problems, I don't see enough work that's actually being done in terms of collaboration with respect to residents to ensure that they understand that this is a place, while people may have a view about TCHC and so on, but this is where they live. And so they too have to take a stake in terms of the, how their buildings operate, whether or not it's around safety, security, whether or not it's about how people respond to, in my case, and I'll address a specific building in my ward, 1021 Birchmount, where you may get a hole in the walls or you may get a hole in someone's unit. That's actually not created by the leadership of TCHC, but it's actually created by residents who live in the area. We've had situations where over the years we've had fires set to doors and so on for a variety of reasons in the hallway, and people are afraid. Well, that's not created by the leadership of TCHC. It's created by the residents. Now, I'm not simply offering a suggestion of blame. What I'm absolutely simply saying is that we all have a shared responsibility to ensure that the place where we live, that we actually care for it, whether or not we own it or not, or whether or not simply we go through a process, whether or not we're paying market rent or simply that we're being subsidized. I think we all have an onus to ensure that we take care of this. I think that the TTC management should ensure that they work with residents, and I'm not sure to the degree that they are, to allow residents to understand that irrespective of the fact whether or not they own the units, they have a responsibility to actually to work to ensure that the units are obviously kept in as best a shape as they can. And I say this because I get complaints from residents saying, well, you know, my neighbor here, I heard them banging on the walls, or I heard them do a number of things, and now they're complaining about the condition of the facilities. I want to make this last point, and I'm going to look at TTHC leadership, because at 1021 Birchmount, in as much as the residents there, Laura Hammond and team, have worked really hard, we have a facility there where we're supposed to be community space. That space has actually degenerated to a degree where the residents don't actually trust TCHC's management. We brought in computers, monitors, they've been stolen. The facility there now has been used for security staff as opposed to the residents. They are deprived of the opportunity to do anything in those units. They went about painting the rooms and so on. It's been removed from them. Now, that's not their fault. And as much as they'd like to do more, we see a situation that because a photo that was just sent to me last week where the door's been broken and all that they have been promised has not been delivered. No fault of their own because they're actually interested in participating. As I said earlier, residents have to take a role in terms of their active space. When they try to do that and there's not the support, that's a real problem. And I will say to you, sir, that at this point in time, the residents at 1021 Birchmount are actually very upset. I invite you to meet me there with them to address their issue. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
This is on item 8.8. You want to speak on 11? Right. So may I just say a few words on 8.8, if I may, and I'll just reset the clock. First of all, I want to thank all the members of the council and the city staff and the people from TCHC, because I think we've had a great team effort here at making sure we made a compelling case. And I think the thing we did that was smart was we made the compelling case to ourselves first. And I think what helped me immeasurably in the advocacy, and I was joined by others, but in being sort of the lead advocate to the other governments, what helped me immeasurably was the fact that we had put very serious money into this from the property taxpayers, recognizing that, you know, we believe, I think, as one, that the property taxpayers should not be expected by themselves to bear probably even the 1/3 share, given the sources of revenue we don't have to finance this. But I think the fact that the City Council, under the previous term of office, stepped up and made the commitment that it has, which continues this year and next, and will continue, I hope, going forward, I think that helped us a lot to say, well, you know, don't do what we say, do what we do. I secondly want to just really acknowledge, and I think quite often the importance of this has been underestimated, of getting the federal government to come to the table. And it was a decade in the making. I remember when I was a broadcaster, Mayor Ford, being at a meeting of the FCM to make the case for this money, because I think we were making it all the way back probably to Mayor Miller's time as well. And I want to just say, and this, I've said this before in a totally nonpartisan spirit, especially given there's an election going on now, but we didn't control that. This is the first meeting we've had since this decision was confirmed by them and now to be confirmed by us. Everybody from the Prime Minister himself through to the Housing Minister, through to the previous Infrastructure Minister, Sohi, through to the Toronto MPs, in particular people like Adam Vaughan and Marco Mendicino, it really was a team effort to make sure this item, which is, I think, unique in all of Canada, you know, got raised to the top of the agenda such that the Prime Minister ultimately was able to announce this money coming here. And I think it represents what I would say is a solid start on achieving what we talked about that day when I stood with Councillor Deputy Mayor Bailau up in northwest Toronto and talked about the fact that we were looking for a third, and a third, which I think was actually a generous offer given that we only rely on property tax revenues, but nonetheless we thought that was fair and it would be an inducement for these other governments to say, fine, we're all sharing in this together. And I think now the task that lies in front of us is to continue the same advocacy work with the province. And I'm not one who is disheartened about that, given even though there was a sort of a backward development in that case, in that we were expecting to have some fairly substantial quantity of money to do some of this work coming from the cap and trade, which was, of course, done away with. And now there's no obvious source of funds for any contribution the province should make to these repairs. But if you look at the principles that lie behind them, I think most of them are principles that a conservative or a progressive conservative, depending on how you want to take that, would buy into. First of all, public assets. These are public assets that are owned by the public, and I think anybody of any sense at all would know that if you own an asset, whether you're a person or a company or a government, the public, you want to maintain those assets rather than let them fall down to the point where they become unusable. And this was something that we were setting out to prevent when we were seeking this money from the federal government. Remember, our goal was not just to repair them to give people decent, dignified, properly repaired housing, but also to stop the closure of units that otherwise would have had to happen had we not had the money to do these repairs. So I think that's consistent with conservative principles. Secondly, dignified, decent homes for residents. That was the second objective, and that speaks to the comments made by Councillor Nunziata, Deputy Mayor Thompson, and others to say, look, that was a principal objective we had as well. Thirdly, things like energy efficiency. We made the case, we've made the case at a number of the places we've gone, that in fact, when you make this investment, it has a, what we would have called in business, a no-brainer payback. It's an immediate payback, and it's very substantial and gets you a return on your investment that is absolutely fantastic by anybody's calculation. That is conservative, consistent with conservative and progressive conservative principles to me. And then finally, as was mentioned, I think, by Deputy Mayor Bilo, the jobs that are created by those renovations, some of them local jobs. But I know that the provincial government is one that says all the time that they're very committed to making sure people are employed in the city. And this creates employment. It has with the money we've spent. It will with the money that is to be spent going forward. So I will continue to advocate to the province for finding a way from, to me, whether it comes from conservation-related programs, whether it comes from job creation programs, it doesn't really matter. The point is here that we need their support to fill out that remaining third, because I think it is entirely proper, given the history that Deputy Mayor Thompson referred to, where they were downloaded supposedly with some money to come for repairs, except that never arrived. And so I think it is time for the province to become our partners in this. I'll just say two very quick things. Number one, I support the comments that were made about a careful and rigorous audit so that we can report to the public on how all this money was being spent. And I think the CMHC expects that anyway. And secondly, I support the comments that Councillor Carroll made with respect to making sure we put a social lens on this in addition to all the other lenses as we go about setting the priorities. And we would just direct that to the TCHC management. So thank you to all concerned, because I think this is the culmination of a part of the effort we had to undertake, with obviously much more to come. Other comments on 8.8? And if not, then we could move. Councillor Pasternak, you want to speak as well, Councillor Nunziata? Okay, we have just one more to do, which is 8.811, and I know Councillor Pasternak has some comments and a motion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I had originally thought it was just a staff undertaking, but clerk suggested we put it in a motion. I think councillors are eager to see where the 39 Toronto community housing location buildings are that are receiving the combined heat and power generators. And I think it's also important, if these are in fact emergency community hubs, that people know where to go in an emergency. I think this is a very worthy program and project. I remember as if it was yesterday the ice storm of 2013, but there were other instances in which we lost power in some of our THC buildings, which are housing many of the most vulnerable residents in our city, including many seniors. I can tell you that I have, I believe, 11 TCH buildings. In the old Ward 10 that I represented for 8 years, we had many older seniors at 6250 Bathurst and 4455 Bathurst, both of which lost power at that time, and there was deep concern about reaching vulnerable seniors on the upper floors. There was no power, the elevators weren't working, the water was shut off. It was a pretty desperate time. So this is exactly what we need. Hopefully this is the start of a wider program where we can get as many buildings as possible fitted with this technology to make sure that they are safe during extreme weather events. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Pasternak. Are there any other speakers on 8.11? Okay, what I'll do then is just proceed to, it's best if we approve each item individually then within the three. And so I would ask that we have a motion to adopt item EX 8.4, which is the item that has to do with the renewal of the mortgage. Moved by Councillor Deputy Mayor Thompson. All those in favor, opposed, carried. Next, we move to item 8.8, and I'll accept a motion to approve and adopt the item coming from Deputy Mayor Bilo. All those in favor, opposed, carried. And then finally, if I can deal first with the motion moved by Councillor Pasternak to ask for the list, as he just discussed a moment ago. All in favor of Councillor Pasternak's amendment? Carried. And then the item as amended. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. And I should just say for the record that if any of Mr. Scheer, Mr. Singh, Premier Ford, Minister Clark, Ms. Horvath comes through with money from the province or any other source, I will be as effusive in my praise of those people as I was in praise of the Government of Canada, which came through with $1.3 billion for us, and that formed the substance of this item. Did I forget? Oh, Mr. Bernier, I'm terribly. Miss May, Mr. Bernier, yeah, any of those people, even the leader of the Bloc Québécois, if he produces the check and we can cash it, I will be effusive in my praise. Thank you. Now, back to the list here. We dealt with 3 items there a little bit. So that takes us next then to item. Oh, just one thing that I forgot in the rundown, I apologize, was I just skipped over in doing the rundown. I skipped over item EX 8.19, Transportation Services 2019 Capital Budget and 2020 to 2028 Capital Plan Adjustments. I'm assuming that would be moved by the Budget Chair. That was just in the rundown. Is there anybody wishing to ask questions or speak on that? Otherwise, we can just ask for the adoption of the item. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. So I think that brings us next then to item EX 8.9 and 8.7. I'm sorry. Oh, yes, 8.7. Creating a gender equity strategy and gender equality office for Toronto. And we have a number of deputations on that, which we will hear first. And the first deputant listed to appear is Harmy Mendoza, Women Abuse Council of Toronto. There you are. Thank you very much for coming this morning. You have 5 minutes in which to make your deputation, and then there may be some questions for you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Harmy Mendoza, and I am the Executive Director of the Women Abuse Council of Toronto.
All right, Ms. Mendoza, I apologize. There's just a bit of hubbub going on. Excuse me. If there are people, excuse me, at the back of the room there, there's hubbub when the deputation is being made. If we could ask those conversations to be taken outside the room, that would be great. Sorry about that. You please start over. I'll start the clock again, too.
Oh, great. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Harmy Mendoza, and I am the Executive Director of the Women Abuse Council of Toronto, or Women Act. Our mission is to eradicate violence against women and advocate and advance for gender equity through coordination, education, research, and policy. We convene and mobilize communities across Toronto to drive system change for women, and we have been doing this for 28 years. I would like to dedicate my deputation to the 148 women and girls killed in 2018 across Canada, 21 of whom lived in Toronto. To the 60 women and girls killed in 2019 across Canada. To Tarshika Jagannathan, killed by her former husband on Wednesday, September 11, 2019 in Toronto. I am here this morning to emphasize and speak to the need for a gender equity strategy and gender equality office for Toronto. While we commend the City of Toronto for undertaking initiatives such as the Gender Equity Tool or applying a gender analysis to strategies such as the Toronto Poverty Reduction Strategy and Housing TO 2020-2030 Action Plan, we know there is more to do. We know that in order to reduce inequities faced by women, girls, trans, and non-binary people across the city, we need to apply an intersectional gender framework and gender-responsive budgeting process to all policy and programmatic areas. Gender inequities still persist in Toronto. Women, girls, trans, and non-binary individuals face higher rates of violence and continue to be murdered by their partners and ex-partners at a substantially higher rate than men. Women are more likely to be unemployed in precarious work and still make less money than their male counterparts. And yet, they make up 52% of the population. The experience of being a Torontonian is indeed gender, and these experiences are further impacted by race, immigration status, disability, sexuality, and socioeconomic status. When we speak to women experiencing violence in Toronto, we hear what these inequalities translate into. Women are unable to live free from violence because of a lack of access to money and housing. Women tell us that they face discrimination by landlords because they are on social assistance or are lone parents, even though we know that 84% of lone parents and families in Toronto are led by women. Women report that they struggle to access employment, childcare, and public services because of a lack of access to transit, even though we know that 59% of public transit users in Toronto are women. Women also tell us that there is still an expectation that they must leave the home and have their lives disrupted when they are experiencing abuse, rather than the perpetrator leaving. This is an expectation that is still reinforced by policy, program, and practices across the city. These experiences are just a few reasons why we need strategies and budgets that take into account the needs of women, as well as work to close the gender gap. Despite a long history of women's policy advocacy, the idea that women's interests should be incorporated into the policy processes is still relatively new. From our experience, integrating an intersectional gender analysis to policies, services, and programs requires dedicated time, resources, capacity building, constant community engagement, as well as a willingness for change. We believe that the city-wide gender equity strategy and gender equality office would meet these needs. We also like to emphasize that this work does not have to happen alone. Women's advocates and organizations across the city have a long history of this work, and we know that our communities across the city, are keen and waiting to share their expertise, tools, and strategies for achieving gender-responsive policy and budgets. We also encourage the Gender Equality Office to closely engage the community in driving priorities. Women Act regularly engages community agencies and women across the city to identify needs and develop policy, program, and practice solutions. We find that when communities are engaged in the decision-making that affects their everyday lives, they feel more valued in their community and are more motivated to build safe, cohesive, and healthy communities. In conclusion, the stakes are incredibly high, and this is not rocket science. We have solutions to closing the gender gap, and this is one of them. We hope that the City of Toronto will demonstrate its commitment to women's safety and gender equality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there questions of the deputy? Well, thank you very much for your comments and appreciate your being here. I'm sorry. Oh, there was a question from Deputy Mayor Thompson.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation. You made mention with respect to violence, and you made mention to the lady that was killed, unfortunately, a couple of weeks ago in Scarborough. In fact, it happened in front of my friend's mom's driveway.
Oh, did it?
Friend's mom was watching,
It's close to
and
you.
she called. So I wanted to ask, and just to ask this question, how will the gender equity strategy, how will that prevent violence? And I know you talked a little bit about jobs and the opportunities for women and so on, but can you maybe just help us to really understand it a little bit more, how this will impact this and what will the opportunities for women be going forward so we can prevent situations like this from happening in the future?
It's definitely a very important beginning, because this is exactly what we need to do. How can we prevent this from ever happening again? One of the areas of work that I didn't actually allude to it is how complex this issue is. This is not only about the municipalities doing what they need to do within what the municipalities' boundaries require, from access to transit, from access to different jobs that, or different possibilities to be able to access more or be economically independent. All of those areas of work that are municipal need to be looked at, and we need to keep asking ourselves, how can we prevent this from happening, taking into consideration all of the policies that you have in place and every others that you can even imagine. Like, for example, let me quickly tell you about this important review that happened in other parts of the world, where they realized that shoveling the streets was helpful for those who were driving. But how about those who were walking, taking the TTC, pushing strollers? They realized that when they started to shovel the snow on the walkways, that there were less accidents, and they realized that women were the ones who were accessing transit more than men, and how important that was for women particularly. And so those are the kind of questions that we need to ask as to gender policy. To say, the other part that I want to add is, how provincial government needs to also be working collaboratively with municipalities and the federal government. Women's live complex lives. They are interconnected with all of the different services and the areas that are faced or overviewed by different government initiatives. So it's about asking how can we prevent this from happening and looking at all of the policies so that we are more conscious as to when we make those decisions and we consider gender as an important base for making those decisions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ms.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Thompson. Any other questions of this deputy? Well, thank you, Ms. Mendoza, very much for your contributions. Next is Saman Tabasi Najad, Progress Toronto. Good morning, welcome.
Good morning.
You have 5 minutes.
Thank
There may
you.
be some questions.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Saman Tabasi Najad, and I work at the not-for-profit Progress Toronto. I'm excited to speak today in support of the recommendations in the staff report before you, and urge this committee to seize the opportunity to make Toronto a more gender-equitable city. And we cannot afford to wait. At Progress Toronto, we advocate for a more equitable and just city. We give Torontonians the tools they need to reach out to their representatives like yourself. I'm sure you all have received lots of emails from us or from constituents, and let you know what their priorities are for the city. Monday afternoon, less than just 2 days ago, we asked people to show their support for bringing a gender equality office and an intersectional gender equity strategy to City Hall. Since then, well over 1,200 people have sent their messages of support to you directly. Actually, if you want to be specific, I just checked, and it was actually 1,289. Each of you have received emails in supporting and of establishing a gender equality office to make Toronto work for everyone. And today, I'm just one voice among the hundreds who have expressed their support. When I was preparing for this deputation, I was happy to receive an email from Mayor John Tory, pledging that he will vote in favor of creating a gender equality office. It was quite great. And I'm glad that the mayor is also recognizing that this is an excellent opportunity for Toronto. Our city can join the ranks of other municipalities who are leading, like LA, New York, Vienna, Boston. And here in Toronto, here in Canada, Vancouver, Calgary, Montreal, and Ottawa. With a gender equality office and an intersectional gender strategy, the city can make sure its budget, its policies, and its programs work to reduce inequality all across Toronto. As you know, issues regarding housing, public transit, and employment disproportionately affect women, trans, non-binary, and gender diverse members of the city more. And they also affect us differently. Diverse women, girls, trans, and non-binary people make up more than half of Toronto's population, but continue to face systemic disparities in our city. Lower wages, higher rates of violence, and poverty are just a few examples to name. Together, with your leadership, Toronto can develop the structure, the strategy, the methodology that can effectively respond to local needs and priority areas, including housing, childcare, safety, leadership, representation, and even civic engagement. Issues I know others speaking before you today have and continue to go into great detail on. This is an exciting opportunity for Toronto, and I can't wait to see how these recommendations play out and make a difference in the lives of people across our great city. Thank you for your time, and please vote in support of the recommendations before you today.
Thank you very much for that deputation. Other questions of the Deputy and Councillor Pasternak?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So prior to the meeting, I went to the City of Toronto's website to see what we're doing in our Human Rights Office in this area, and we have a unit that does equity, diversity, inclusion. It has a pretty detailed policy statement. Do you think that this is not going far enough, or it's not funded well enough, or it's not getting the job done? But clearly, the city's been pretty active in this since, I think, 2003.
Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going far enough, and we've heard examples just from Harmy from Women Act right before me, and as well as I've experienced it myself. I actually used to work in Councillor Pasternak's ward at the Duke Heights BIA, and last year during the crazy snowstorms, I took the transit, I took the bus. I had to walk on the street to be able to actually get to my place of employment because the snowbanks were just so big. And this is actually kind of a gendered perspective. If we take a gendered and equity lens to this issue, we see that priorities for snow plowing are the streets and the roads, and then the sidewalks are left behind. Unfortunately, this affects women and gender diverse individuals, diversity more, because we know the stats that women and other non-men use transit and use the sidewalks more so than men, and that's one way, and just like a very kind of easy way of making sure that women and gender diverse individuals have better access to mobility and getting around our city and making this city work better for everyone else.
Okay,
Thanks,
thank you.
Councillor Pasternak. Other members of the committee or otherwise wishing to ask questions of this deputant? Okay, well, we'll thank you very much then for your deputation and for answering the questions. Next is Leila Sarangi, Family Service Toronto. Welcome.
Thank you.
You have 5 minutes to make any comments you want to make, up to 5 minutes, and there may be some questions for you.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and the Executive Committee, for the opportunity today to speak and express support for creating a gender equity strategy and a gender equality office in the City of Toronto. I currently work at Family Service Toronto, and I coordinate a national anti-poverty campaign, but you know me from my work on the Mayor's Advisory Committee on Poverty Reduction, and my work on the External Review Committee for the Equity Budgeting process. This morning, I submitted a letter to you on behalf of 30 organizations, networks, and individuals expressing support for the recommendations before you. We recognize that the city has implemented processes that begin to shift policy and budget decision-making from one that didn't consider gender at all to one that begins to center the experiences of diverse women, two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people. Equity tools that are applied to budget decisions across all divisions and that center the experiences of women and low-income folks have been piloted in the last 3 budget cycles, and a similar tool is being piloted right now at the Poverty Reduction Work Plan, and we really commend the work of staff to move this forward under this leadership. But these gender mainstreaming tools do not go far enough. At its very core, a gender equity framework acknowledges and analyzes the underlying root causes of disparities that different groups of people face based on their social, cultural, and economic identities. It recognizes that revenues and expenditures of city budgets and policy decisions impact women in particular ways, and that these effects are compounded when gender intersects with other identities that include Indigenous identity, race, culture, religion, language, citizenship and immigration status, amount and source of income, family status, ability, sexual identity and orientation, age, geographic location in the city, among others. The goal of a gender equity framework is to redress and remedy these systemic disparities through fair taxation and a fair allocation of resources. Governments that successfully use a gender equity framework, both in budgetary decisions and policy development, make a strong commitment to collecting, understanding, and publishing disaggregated data through the investment of time and resources. To fully understand this data, there must be robust, ongoing engagement processes in place with diverse women who are impacted by these decisions, and that include consultation on the design, implementation, and evaluation processes. Community-driven indicators, measurements, and accountability mechanisms are essential to achieving successful outcomes and positively impacting people's lives. The urgent need to adopt the recommendations before you cannot be understated, and you have before you a staff report that outlines the number of ways that women and gender diverse people continue to face discrimination and marginalization in Toronto. The city has offices and strategies that address the disparities among every equity dimension except gender. By choosing to allocate the requested resources to this, which is really a small fraction, a small part of the city's budget, Toronto will be joining the ranks of other major national and international cities for gender equity and be true to our motto of diversity is our strength. And I look forward to being a continued partner in this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Arangi. Are there questions for the deputy? Okay, well, hearing none, I'll thank you very much for being here. Oh, I'm sorry, Councillor Wong-Tam.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Just following up on the question that came from Councillor Thompson and Councillor Pasternak, with respect to the effectiveness of the gender equality strategy, how could it prevent violence against women, and how could it also ensure that when we create cities, and especially the built form, that actually takes into consideration the users of all genders?
Thank you for that question. It would help us to have processes right now when the processes that I'm a part of, we're making decisions around the budget where money should be allocated without looking at the current strategies that exist in the city. So we're being asked to make these decisions without the right kind of information. But by having a strategy that lays out a plan for minimizing disparities, for addressing women's experiences of violence. That includes, I spent 20 years working in women's shelters, and the barriers to getting women into safe, affordable, adequate housing, childcare, affordable childcare. These are all city services. We're not allocating resources in the right kinds of ways to make sure women can access these kinds of social safety supports. The other question for me too is, is this still accepted? Why is violence accepted? What needs to happen around public education and the campaigns that Toronto invests in to really say that this is not okay? Where's the accountability for the perpetrators? The restraining orders, those pieces of paper, they don't go far enough for protecting women. So we need, in terms of changing attitudes around violence and in terms of changing mechanism, we need an equity strategy that lays that roadmap out, that talks to the budget process, so we're investing into those places and really addressing these root causes.
Okay. Councillor Wong-Tam, thank you very much. Councillor Carroll, for a question.
I just want, your last comments, some of this is not about budget, but it's about how we develop policy as well.
Absolutely.
We can provide affordable housing, we can provide social housing, especially to women experiencing violence, but some of our policies can isolate them. We give them the housing, but then they're afraid to mention if they're having a problem because they may face eviction. So it's not, we're setting this up not just to have an impact on our budget that we might dread, but in our policy development and staff training, this office would really help change things.
Absolutely, and there are so many of those policy decisions that wouldn't cost the city anything and would have such huge impacts in communities, in people's lives, for the women and children who live in our city who are really, overrepresented in low-income populations, who are overrepresented in folks who are facing barriers to accessing those services. So we need, the newcomer strategy, the senior strategy, the youth strategy, the poverty reduction strategy. Barely any of them talk about women's particular experiences or gender diverse particular experiences in those areas, but we could map out. My vision of a gender equity strategy would be something that's not its own thing, but that is actually interacting with the existing equity strategies of the city. And many of the ideas and ways of addressing these disparities, they don't cost money, but we need these resources. We need people within on staff at the city level who have an expertise in gender-based analysis to be able to develop this. And we need those folks to be, as my colleague said before me, working with the people who are impacted on the ground. It has to be a community-driven process. It has to center on the experiences of people who have lived through this, who are experts in their lives and who have the knowledge and solutions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Councillor Carroll. Councillor Thompson, Deputy Mayor. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So this is a very complex issue. Would you agree?
I agree it's complex, but it's not unattainable.
No, that's not the question I asked. I asked if you thought it was a complex issue.
Absolutely.
Exactly. So the office itself and the strategy has to deal with very complex issue, because one of the things that the comments you made in your comment about, I think you talked about restraining orders, for example. So we don't govern that. It is through the legal, the courts, and so on. So having an office that addresses a very complex issue that puts in place, first of all, a plan, a series of elements that address some of the things, for example, that we don't control but needs to be part of the strategy. So it makes sense then that we would have people who are focusing specifically in this area to deal with this complex issue, and that's part of the reason why we have to set up a structure, because it requires much more in-depth, detailed research, analysis, and so on. So it isn't just one element where it's just a municipal element. While we may drive component parts of it, there are many other elements that need to be brought into the mix. Would you agree?
I agree. I agree,
Please.
and I feel that I believe that it has to work across all divisions in the city. It is an intersectional issue, and it has to work across all levels of government. And the province of Ontario has a gender-based violence strategy that can work very nicely with something that at the city in terms of partnerships and moving forward together on these issues and on those areas that we need to address that aren't part of city jurisdiction. And the federal government has a gender-based violence strategy, and this is, international, right? The UN has said Canada should have a national action plan. All countries should. This is, we're talking about international standards, but there are mechanisms at every other level of government except for this one to be able to address this really important issue. And so, yes, we need an office. It is complex, but there are pathways already to achieving this.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Any other questions of the deputy? I see none, so I'll thank you very much for your deputation, for your answers to the questions, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Next, we have Anjum Sultana. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here.
very much.
You have up to 5 minutes to make comments, and then there may be some questions.
Dear Toronto City Council Executive Committee, Mayor John Tory, gender justice advocates in the room, and residents across Toronto, hello and thank you. Today is a pivotal moment to really demonstrate the leadership that Toronto has already been showing and achieving. Today what I want to talk about is the perspective of Millennial Women in Policy. So my name is Anjum Sultana, and I'm the founder of Millennial Women in Policy, a grassroots organization headquartered in Toronto, focused on advancing the perspectives of self-identified millennial women and non-binary people in policymaking processes at all orders of government. In less than a year, we've hosted 5 events across the country, and we have 1,800 people in our community from across Canada and also North America, generally speaking. And as an organization that is committed to fostering community, exchanging insights, and building the skills of the next generation of policy leaders, we want to say thank you to the City of Toronto and encourage you to pass this motion, because we see the importance of embedding a gender equity lens in the way we make decisions and allocate resources in society. That's why, again, we're very pleased to see the City of Toronto is demonstrating this world-class leadership. And in short order, in a short period of time, we've actually passed on a letter to the city clerk on behalf of over 60 millennial women in policy in the city who also want to see this passed. And like many of my colleagues before me have said, we would be joining other cities as well, such as Vienna, Boston, LA, and in Canada, Montreal, Vancouver, Edmonton, Ottawa. So it's really time for Toronto to also move in this direction. My colleagues before me have talked about the connections between gender equality and why investments in this office and strategy would address gender-based violence. What I also want to share to the committee here is that by investing in something like this, a gender equity strategy and gender equality office, will actually be improving the economic conditions and also the economy of Canada and specifically Toronto as well. A recent report by McKinsey has stated that if we were able to actually address gender inequality in this nation, we would actually add $150 billion to the economy. And that is by 2025, so that's not very long. And so this is something where City of Toronto can start to participate and also see the gains by actually addressing gender equality. Some comments have been made about the cost, but here what we see is that the investments here will be brought back to us in greater dividends. And Furthermore, not only will the economics of this city be improved, the conditions of the constituents in your riding day in, day out will be improved. On a personal note, I want to share that I've also benefited by the great gender investments made in the city. I'm a graduate of the City of Toronto Protege program, and actually spent some time with Councillor Shelley Carroll. And you know, what we saw was that when you invest in people, when you invest in women, girls, gender diverse folks, we see market changes in society. And so really, this is a down payment on what we want this society to be, what we want the City of Toronto to be. What I also want to share is, you know, it really speaks to the legacy also of the late City Councilor Pam McConnell, and I've had the good fortune of being on the selection committee that she is in our honor for young women leadership, and I see the incredible leadership that's happening in the city. What I'd be interested in seeing is if we establish an office like this, how much further can we go? How much further can we improve the communities that we're part of day in, day out? What I'll end on is, our organization is pan-Canadian, and we see across the country the important gains that can be made by investing in strategies such as this before you. And what I'll say is that we need to step up also, because on the world stage, I don't know if folks here know, next year is the 25-year anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action on Gender Equality. So it's been 25 years since that platform has come out. And I'll be reporting on the work that Canada has been doing. I'm representing civil society in Geneva later in October, and I would love, when I go there, when I'm speaking on my remarks of what Canada has achieved, to say that Toronto has stepped up and invested in a gender equality office. So again, thank you so much for your time. We're actually, this is a momentous opportunity, a one to celebrate, and I really am thankful to each and every one of you for the leadership you're demonstrating today, and I look forward to following this issue and your investments in a gender equity office strategy and a gender equality office. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Sultana. Are there questions of the deputy? Okay, thank you so much for being here with us this morning.
Thank you all.
Rachel Listener. Ms. Listener here? Rachel Listener? Okay. Jasmine Ramsey Rezai, YWCA Toronto. Good morning. Thanks for coming this morning. You've seen from the others you have 5 minutes or up to 5 minutes, and then there may be some questions for you.
Okay. So good morning, and thank you for having me. My name is Jasmine Ramsey-Rezai, and I am the manager of advocacy at YWCA Toronto. YWCA Toronto, as you may know, is the city's largest multi-service women's organization. Our association serves over 13,700 women and their families every year in more than 32 programs in 11 locations across the city. We have a deep and proud history of partnership with the City of Toronto, particularly in providing housing for women and their families. We've operated gender-responsive programs for 146 years, and we are a subject matter expert on gender equity, which is why we're all here today, or at least the previous speakers and I, to strongly speak in favor of the recommendations before you. We have deputed year after year at the City Budget Committee calling for a gender equity lens in the budget process. Why is this important? Because women face systemic disparities. Because racialized women, women with disabilities, elderly women, LGBTQ plus women, non-binary folks are impacted by city decisions in nuanced and sometimes unintended ways. However, without tracking these impacts, there is no substantive way for the city to create evidence-based policies in support of women and their families, or to truly respond to community needs. We think it is vitally important for the City of Toronto to understand how gender impacts services so that the communities we work with can thrive and succeed. The women who attend our programs tell us of the challenges they face accessing childcare, safe housing, nutritious food, and public transit. The 1 out of 4 children who live in poverty in Toronto do not live alone. They are often from single women households. Women are more likely to work precarious jobs. There's a wage gap, a gender wage gap, a racial wage gap, and there's a strong connection between poverty, homelessness, and gender-based violence for women. And despite all the good intentions, the interests of women have not been fully protected or reflected in budgetary decisions and processes and in the strategic priorities of the city. And for these reasons, we need an intersectional gender lens at the City of Toronto. We need a strategy, and we need an office. In short, you have this incredible opportunity before you to really demonstrate your commitment to gender equity to all Torontonians. We all stand to benefit from this. So we hope you heed the urgency of our call, our collective calls, and demonstrate what responsive leadership looks like. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. Are there questions of the deputy? Well, we see none, but thank you very much for coming. I appreciate that very much. Okay, am I right? Was there one added? Yes. That was Miguel Villa Velarde. Miguel, please come forward. I think you know the rules.
Yes, we all acknowledge this is a very complex and difficult topic to discuss. I understand there are good men and there are bad men out there. Some of us, we screw up. Some of us, we have redeemed ourselves and we want to be with our children. This is my child, my kid. I am a proud member of the Canadian Centre for Men and Families. We advocate for men and their children to be united. We're talking about gender equality. We're talking about optics. Did you know that when two parents are in receipt of social assistance or unemployment, one parent qualifies for legal aid? That was my story to me and many parents, particularly in 2013 when I wanted to apply for sharing custody of my kids with my ex. I did not have a lawyer to represent me in court, a family court. I was told you need a duty counsel. Duty counsel is a lawyer who may be punished by the legal society to help people with complex cases. You only have half an hour to introduce yourself and explain your problem to the lawyer in the hope that he will represent you in court. Most of the time, they're not aware of the complexity of the issues surrounding a separation and divorce. So the Canadian Centre for Men and Families assists me to find a lawyer. In that way, I can get access and visit to my kids again. You know, one of the problems that we have when we talk about gun violence and gang association for our children is the lack of a parent figure. So I'm here to speak as a man who has been mistreated by the legal system by not providing a lawyer to represent in court, and that is the case of many male parent fathers out there. This Canadian Families Centre for Men and Families has been vilified by many groups that they are labeled as men's rights groups, two men, and we excluding the rest. No, on the contrary, we also help gay parents, men and women who want to get some help with their legal troubles. TCAC has spent a considerable amount of money in paying agencies like the ladies here present. One of them is METRAC. METRAC provides legal advice and provides a great workshop for residents to learn about the complexities of the law. Again, I spoke of this matter to TCAC and I told them, look, this is a center that you can invite them to come and talk to the men that live in TCAC so that in the hope they can get reunited with their children, because we are, at the end of the day, we have a heart, and what I would like to see in the recommendations made today is to see some kind of funding for parents, for dads who are unable to get a legal aid certificate to defend themselves in family court. Currently, it's difficult to get a legal aid certificate, again, as I mentioned, when two parents are both on social assistance or on some sort of assistance by the government. So you see the inequities of the system. One parent is pinned against another parent, and at the end, some parents, some males give up. There's 80% of male suicides are men in the city of Toronto. It is sad to see that 80% of men kill themselves. So many of them, they give up because it's difficult to fight the family court. It's so impossible. It's like a wall. It's a huge barrier. It's stacked up against men. So if you want to be equal, you should include men in the conversation and provide funding for those men who are unable to get a legal aid certificate. And please, ask TCAC to include the presentations of the Canadian Center for Men and Families so that men can find hope, because that's all we have, hope, so that we can get reunited with our kids again, because we love them. And just because you screw up one time, it doesn't mean that we are condemned forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. And are there any questions of the deputant? Okay, that completes the deputations on this item. So we would move to questions of staff. Any questions of staff for Councillor Carroll?
Yes, I was just wondering if staff want to comment on my question of the deputant because we have previously had all the motions and the actions to have a gender lens on the budget specifically. If we form this office, would the intention be that whenever we're developing policy, or perhaps if the Ombudsman or AG is recommending a change of systems or policy, that this office might also be a place where we'd send things for that analysis?
The Speaker, yes. So the Gender Equity Unit would, like the Equity and Diversity and Human Rights Office currently, provide advisory services to all city divisions, including our accountability officers who do reach in for advice. It would also provide the opportunity to actually proactively work with divisions on the other strategies that are being developed across the city. So yes, it will provide a lot of the work. Initially, we'll be developing an overall strategy and engagement with the public, but in the meantime, having people in-house who have the gender equity expertise will help with providing advice and guidance. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. That's my
Thank you, Councillor Carroll. Other questions of staff on this matter? Councillor Pasternak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to the city manager, I did ask one of the deputants because I wanted their perspective on it. We have an equity, diversity, and inclusion unit at the City of Toronto. It has a phone number, a dedicated email address, and a pretty detailed policy covering many of the things in this report. Now, I'm just wondering, I guess it's the perception of the deputants and the originators of this motion that this doesn't go far enough, or this is not getting the job done. What would be your take on this? Or what we're doing currently in the city?
Well, I would say, I mean, first of all, what we are doing already when compared to other cities across the country is certainly exceptional. But I think the issue here, and I think it's captured in the report, why there's a need for this particular office, is to continue to evolve our equity lens. And I think with that is the importance of having people who wake up every day dedicated to really many of the issues that the presenters just provided us. So I think in some respects, their comments about it doesn't go far enough aren't off the mark. I'm going to ask Alma to add to what I've said already, but we did give that consideration. I mean, was that something that we could just simply expand upon that already exists? And there are reasons that we felt that that this effort needed to be made in this particular way. So maybe Alma, if you can.
Happy to add to that. I'd say a couple of things. So the city does have an Equity, Diversity, and Human Rights Division, and I just want to give you a unit, and I want to give you a breakdown of the staff in that office. So the staff in that office, 7 people in that office are the Human Rights Office. They have a particular role. They do investigations when people file human rights complaints against the city, and they do education related to the Human Rights Code in particular. So that is the focus of their work. In addition, 3 people in that office are the Accessibility Unit. So they provide advice and services related to the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and also building a culture of accessibility by design at the city. So that is their focus. So then there are 4 people who are dedicated to equity more broadly. So they do work on the city's Count Yourself In survey. They do work on the equity responsive budgeting work. They do a whole range of. They do work on LGBTQ strategy. So there are only 4 people in that office that are doing equity work more broadly. So they are producing a lot of work considering the size of that unit. But this is dedicated work that requires dedicated expertise. And what we're looking at is have been doing a lot of work in this area, but the outcomes for women, trans, and non-binary people are not what we want them to be. So we are looking at dedicated resources and dedicated expertise to do a deep dive. And our jurisdictional scan has indicated that that has been successful in other places where they have established units like that. So that is the strategy that we're recommending. But as the city manager indicated, the first start was, can we do this within existing resources? And the answer is we cannot, not the focus that we require. And the work that is necessary for us to build the partnerships that will be critical to this work. The city cannot do this on its own. We are one player in this massive system, and we need to work with our partners, and we need people to kind of take that on. This is not a side of the desk type of effort.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I had next was Councillor Ainsley and then Councillor Nunziata.
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is the city manager or not, or staff, but I wanted to ask, so there's a number of references around governance, and I was curious about how this strategy and how this office would look at when we have our civic appointments process, when we look at our agencies, boards, and commissions, how the strategy in the office would apply to that process.
I'll ask Amba.
To that. So one of the things that we will be doing initially is doing some consultations with our community partners and with the public to figure out what we really need to be prioritizing. So, but in theory, the office, once the unit once established, will be available for us. For instance, our public appointments process. This year, we did a lot of work. The accessibility team did a lot of work with them on encouraging people with disabilities to apply for appointment, and we had some success in that respect. So I can envision that once this unit is established, that the next time we're going through public appointments, that the public appointments unit will also have access to the unit to provide advice on what strategies might be effective in ensuring like better gender representation in our public appointments.
Okay, and will the office and the strategy be used to set, I guess, benchmarking or parameters around appointments? And I guess I'm looking for a proactive approach that they'll be going to the public appointments or civic appointments and not just hoping the committee will ask for advice.
So this an important part of the strategy, because we want to be accountable and we want to make sure that what we're doing is actually effective, is going to be accountability mechanisms. So benchmarks and goals would be an important part of that work. And so yes, the strategy will have clear timelines and a plan, and would be coming back for approval say, do we have the go ahead to do this? And then so for not just the public service, but also for our leaders and council also to endorse this strategy as the way forward for the city.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor Tory.
Thanks to Councillor Ainsley. Councillor Nunziata.
Question. We do fund agencies as well, don't we? In
Our
various
agency
communities for gender equity strategy and dealing with violence against women and all the issues that you've identified in your report. We do now fund agencies to provide those services to the community, do we not?
Yes, I believe that the city has a number of funding mechanisms that do fund community agencies to do work in this area. So this will not be focused on in the community. This will be focused on the services that we provide and the programs that we provide as a city ourselves, and training that we can provide to our staff as well on how we actually work with those agencies to do our bit.
So there'll be partnerships with the agencies?
That is envisioned, correct.
Thank you, Councilor Nunziata. Any further questions of staff on this matter? Okay. Thank you to our staff for those answers, and now we could move to speakers. We have two members of council visiting with us today, and so they wish to speak. All right, Councilor Wong-Tam first. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Mayor Tory, for the opportunity to speak. And I want to start by just, number one, acknowledging that in the room we have a number of longtime advocates and women from the community who have been working for years directly in the front lines to deliver services that make a critical, important, life-saving services oftentimes in the lives of women in the City of Toronto. And I want to thank you for bringing your perspective to the table. Also to staff for writing this particular report. I think that as one of the movers of the motion, the second one was Councillor Perks. I think that we wanted to just, number one, provide an opportunity to actually elevate the conversations that we were having in the city around the issues of equity. And I think that this is a very important topical subject matter. 52% of the population are women, girls, non-binary, and trans people, including people from gender diverse communities. And when we're building our city services and designing the programmings and then going out to deliver those services, what ends up happening is that sometimes we fall short. And that means that there are biases that are built into the programs, not necessarily because they're villains, but because there are different perspectives that are missing when we're actually informing the process to deliver those programs, deliver those services, and to design the implementation. And so what ends up happening is that we end up spending lots of money to deliver these services, hoping to get better outcomes. But then what we find is that structurally and systematically, there is a population that is not gaining access. So for example, getting to Councillor Thompson's point about how could a gender equity strategy and perhaps the office could have prevented violence against women. If women have access to housing, if women have access to employment, if women have access to transit in the more remote places of our suburban neighborhoods, they would be able to independently, through their own means, leave those abusive relationships. They would be able to gain access to housing that is affordable and that's safe for them. They would be able to take care of their children if there are child care services that are available to them. All of that means that the systems and the services that we are designing at the city to provide access to individuals have got to be knitted together. And when there are gaps, and these discriminatory gaps do exist, that's when people fall through the cracks. And when they fall through the cracks, sometimes it can be lethal. Which is why I really appreciate that there has been some conversation focused around the violence impacts. And poverty, we know, actually is one of those subject matters that really women, and racialized women in particular, women living with disabilities, women who are trans-identified, they experience that in ways that many of us will not necessarily because of additional privileges that we have. And if we don't design for those who are the most marginalized in our city, it means that we're spending a lot of good time and energy. The big brains are coming to develop these systems, to build our parks, to build our community centers, to build all the city services that we need, including housing, including transit, but we're somehow excluding access to that population. And if we are able to put a gender lens over all our decision making, then we know that it's going to build equity and access for men and women, boys and girls. It's actually good business sense because it actually helps us reach the constituents that we desperately want to reach. It actually enables us to provide service to those who most deeply need it, and it actually ends up being a bit of an equalizer. With respect to the funding of organizations that the city provides some supports to, I think that we can acknowledge that the funding of those organizations goes directly to the services that are providing in those communities. This strategy, which will be developed in consultation with the subject matter experts, and some of them are in the room, and there's 50 and 60 other organizations that would like to get involved. I think that would be very helpful to draw upon what they already know. So we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel because they're already doing some of this work. But what they've struggled with is how do they get governments to help bridge those structural gaps? And that's why this strategy is going to help become that sort of inclusive place where people can get involved and participate in delivering better services, better programs, and better outcomes. And so that's what the big difference is. And I want to thank the mayor for his leadership and all those on the executive committee. Should you support this strategy, we're going to be doing something fantastic. We're actually not necessarily leading the country on this. Montreal has got some time on top of this before us, and so does the city of Vancouver, so is Ottawa now, and we're definitely decades behind cities such as Vienna in Austria. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Councillor Wong Tam. Others, Councillor Carroll, wishing to speak? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, just to explain why I was pushing on, policy development as well as developing, the lens on how we spend. Sometimes we actually succeed with the best of intentions. We create more housing situations, and we move women in abusive relationships to the top of the list. But we set policies that unintentionally continue to isolate them because we haven't really put a lens on the life they're living. You don't actually shed an abusive spouse in one day, ever. It just never happens that way. But if we do all the good things here and we move someone into a house, and everyone in their social circle and everyone who serves in the placement office or whatever says, good for you, you got rid of that person, we're putting you in this house. And that person comes back. And there's a feeling that we have rigid policy around why you're here and how you'll be evicted. That person will not tell anyone that they're having trouble shedding that spouse. If it's affecting the children, she will not tell the school because they might call Children's Aid. We might evict you from your housing. Children's Aid has rigid policies. And so sometimes our policies, although we've spent money and had the best of intentions, we have continued to isolate that person until you have the situation where that abusive spouse eventually murders that partner. And so that's why I think this office has to be ongoing, because we don't just need them once a year at budget time. We need them to do the analysis and unpack situations, unpack every report that comes forward from the Ombudsman to look at, okay, now let's put this lens on this and see if our policy played a part here, and how do we adapt it to build the support in to never repeat history. Because that's a little piece of history that gets repeated again and again through the generations. And anyone who's lived through that situation, while they might not publicly nod their head, they're living it now, or they know someone who has lived it and wishes that instead of saying, hooray, you got rid of that spouse, wishes instead they had said, it's great that they're gone, but it's not that easy, so please keep talking to us. That would have changed the whole scenario. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Carroll. Others wishing to speak? Representative Revillo.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm a firm believer in the role of government to create conditions for our citizens to succeed. And when we have 50% of our population that is still facing payment gaps, you look at our boards and they're still not represented, leadership, they're still not represented. I mean, there's lots of work to be done. But this is the macro, and everybody loves to talk these talking points. Everybody loves it. And when I was reading this report, I was actually reflecting of how I could have used this office. And I wanted to tell you about this example because a few years ago at TCHC, we really wanted to get more women involved in the trades because, again, we're spending a lot of money, and we wanted to get women involved in the trades. And, for example, some of the unions, the painters' unions, said they're actually excellent. And so we were having a really hard time. And we came across the fact that the main obstacle was daycare, because the daycare didn't open early enough for them to leave their kids in daycare. So we were banging our heads against the wall to try to get women involved, trying to do outreach for them, saying this is a great career, come, workshops, everything, and we weren't addressing the cause of the problem. They really wanted to do that, but they needed an hour early of daycare, they were receiving subsidies, and they needed that daycare. So that's the issue that we needed to address. It was that the daycare in that community, if we really wanted to address that issue. So I am hoping that this is the kind of issues that if we have an office putting that lens on some of these policies, that we actually become more effective and efficient getting our end results and create those better opportunities for our citizens and our communities. So that's why I'm supporting this. I think it will be a great tool to help us be more effective in creating policy and get us to the place that we want to get. So thank you, and I'll be supporting this.
Others wishing to speak? If not, I'll just say a word or two if I can. I look at this and I say to myself that, you know, there is no question, facts tell you, and experiences that we have as people in public life going out and seeing the living condition of and the lived experience of people that live in the city, that there is still a challenge to be met here. And I was very interested in hearing the breakdown, which I've read before in the context of this report and others, as to the existing deployment of resources that are trying to move us forward as a city on some of these different issues. And of course, it's interesting when you hear once again that yes, there are people up there, but a specific group, for example, that are devoted exclusively to human rights complaints that come to the city, as well should be the case. The same with accessibility, where we face a piece of legislation with very definite deadlines and with other sort of moral and legal obligations to look after people who of differing abilities. But I would say to myself, if we have, at the same time, and I have said to myself in the context of this recommendation, if you have a situation where I think I'm right in saying, just as an example, 49% of the employees of the City of Toronto itself are women, and yet 20% of the people who are in leadership positions in the city government are women, that is something that is deserving of attention, just to name one. We've heard repeated references in our discussion today to violence. And there can be no question but that recent episodes included, recent tragic episodes, that those who are victimized by violence are more often than not women. Street safety. There is no question but that those, again, who experience a lack of street safety or challenges with respect to street safety are more often women than men. And the one, to me, that is most prevalent and that I see most often in my travels through the city as the mayor is the issue of poverty and the experience that the number of children who live in circumstances that we would want to try and are trying very hard to get them out of, but that as was said by at least one of the deputants, those children are often living in women with a single woman as the person that is their caregiver. And so I think that if you look at why we'd want to do this, there's a moral case to be made. There's no question about that. And the devotion of an office of two people in this very large civic administration that does many things for many people, to me, is something that is going to create opportunity. It's going to create a greater degree of equity. Hopefully, that's the purpose here. It's going to deal with moving us forward on gender equality. But it's also going to create opportunities and better lives for people. I, for one, will be certainly looking to see, in the same context as I do with respect to the Anti-Black Racism Office, with respect to the Poverty Reduction Program itself, a work plan that allows us to know what the office is going to be doing in a given year. And then, of course, if you know what they're doing and what they've said they want to do, you can also then measure what they've achieved and see that it is performing the roles that we want it to achieve. But if you don't buy into the moral case about opportunity and better lives and addressing some of these things that I've just given 3 or 4 examples of that occur to me, there's also, I think, a very strong sort of business case to be made for this, in that I think if you address even a small portion of all of those things I mentioned and all of the other things that have been mentioned by the deputants, you are going to increase economic activity and increase the participation of women in the economy of the City of Toronto and the economy of the country, an opportunity for them. But you are also going to decrease, I think, significantly the amount that we invest in all kinds of areas in programs that are meant to support people and address them after they've fallen into a position where they're struggling. So I think that there's a powerful business case to be made for an investment here of $300,000 plus out of a city budget that is in the billions, of course. The final point that I want to make is simply this. I sort of look oftentimes at these things. I spoke to a very large group of international professionals last night, and they'd asked me to address the question, why Toronto, in the cause of trying to sort of tell them why people should and why people are investing here. And I said one of the most powerful things I think that is attracting people to Toronto is our way of life. And it is a way of life that says we embrace people, no matter who they are, no matter what their attributes are. And the notion that, and as much as I could proudly say last night, how we do things here, I acknowledged, as I always do, and we all do, I think, that while we're leaders, and the city manager made reference to this, we still have lots of work to do in order to achieve a situation or a place where we can be entirely satisfied with that. And I think if you look at the world's leading cities, a lot of them are falling into the trap of sort of becoming polarized and divided thanks to people who are out trying to foment that sort of thing. We're not. But the world's leading cities are also dedicating some resources to achieving exactly what is talked about here. We've heard them mentioned this morning: New York City, Los Angeles, Boston, Vancouver, Montreal, Ottawa. These are cities in our own country and outside. And I guess I would just say to those who are critical of this effort, I can't imagine a situation in which all those cities and all of their mayors and all of their councils and all of their public services are wrong, and those who say this is kind of a waste of time and money are right. Why would all those cities decide there's a moral and a business case? Because I'm sure they looked at both. So I'm very comfortable on all of those bases that we should move forward with this, and I think it'll be another reason why we can be proud and talk about our city. When they say, why Toronto, we can say because. Admittedly, perhaps as Councillor Wong-Tam said, a little later than some, but we're doing it, and I think it's something that's worthy of the support of the members of this committee, and I hope they will. Thank you. So, hearing no other comments, if there aren't any, I will ask that we, let me just find my agenda underneath. Here we are. Sorry, I just have to find my place. We went out of order in a couple of things. There we are. So I will ask that we address ourselves to the question on the recommendations here, directing the city, we're going through to council, that the city people officer be directed to develop a City of Toronto gender equity strategy, and the unit and the resources going with that. So I'll ask for the question on the recommendation. All those in favor? Sure. Recorded vote.
On the item, all in favor: Mayor Tory, Councillor Copper, Councillor Bailao, Councillor Ainsley, Councillor Thompson, Councillor Pasternak, Councillor Nziata. That carries unanimously.
Thank you very much. Okay, that was 8.7. We did 8.8. Let's see if I go to the sheet of what's left to be dealt with here. We have next the 8.9, the child transition benefit and the elimination of the child transition benefit, and our response to that. And we have some deputants on that. We have two, and the first is Miguel Avila Velarde. You're going to pass up the opportunity to depute? Oh, thank you, Miguel. Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Then we have Jillian Reese, Willowdale Community Legal Services. Good morning, and thank you for being here this morning. And you have up to 5 minutes, and then there may be some questions for you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Jillian Reese, and I'm a staff lawyer at Willowdale Community Legal Services. As part of my role, I co-chair the Social Assistance Action Committee, a group of Toronto Legal Clinic caseworkers who support each other's legal work and advocate together about systemic issues in social assistance. I am here to talk to you today about the city's role in addressing the province's elimination of the transition child benefit. Thank you, Mayor Tory, for mentioning earlier the issue of child poverty in our city. The transition child benefit is the social assistance benefit for children's basic necessities, things like food, clothing, baby formula, and diapers. Core social assistance benefits do not cover basic necessities for children. Instead, they are designed to integrate with the Canada Child Benefit, which provides most children with financial support to meet these basic needs. For example, a family of 4 consisting of 2 parents and 2 children receives approximately $1,250 per month from Ontario Works, whereas a family of 6 with 2 more children receives only $88 more. To meet the needs of their children, most social assistance recipients receive between $450 and $530 per month through the Canada Child Benefit. The TCB is for families on social assistance who do not qualify for or receive these child tax benefits. Currently, families receive up to $230 per month per child from the TCB. The provincial government will be cutting this benefit effective November 1st. The cut will affect 16,000 families in Ontario with 32,000 children. Over 4,000 of those families are Ontario Works recipients in Toronto. The temporary family housing benefit proposed today is a needed stopgap. It is not, however, a means to buy time for our most vulnerable community members to find alternatives to their already impoverished budgets. It is a means to buy time for the City of Toronto and other municipalities and other advocates to convince the province to provide children with shelter and food. Surely, some families will be able to file their taxes and become eligible for the Canada Child Benefit within the next 6 months. But most families who receive the TCB will not be eligible for the tax benefit within that time frame. For example, families may receive the TCB because they are being audited by the CRA and their Canada Child Benefits are on hold. CRA audits or disputes can take months to resolve. A client of ours was out of the country for a few years. When she returned, she applied for the Canada Child Benefit again and was assessed with a historic overpayment. It took 8 months for the CRA to reinstate her benefits. In the meantime, she would not have been able to afford her rent without receiving the TCB for her 2 children. Of course, she repaid the TCB when she received the tax benefit. Another group without access to the tax benefit is residents without regularized status. Refugees make up 35% of the families who need the TCB. Those families will not be eligible for the tax benefit until they become permanent residents or citizens. This includes children fleeing persecution in their home countries, or even Canadian-born children whose parents are seeking protection. Other families affected are those who encounter changes in their circumstances in the middle of a tax year. The social assistance system is the most responsive means of providing financial support. For example, if a child changes custody, then the custodial parent might rely on the TCB until the CRA processes the new custody arrangement. Without this benefit, families may be unable to care for their children during the transition period. The province is responsible for targeting the most vulnerable children in our society. When parents become unable to feed their children or pay the rent, there will be an increase in evictions and homelessness and more use of food banks. This will have a long-lasting impact on children's health and development. These cuts, like others the province has announced, will download this financial obligation onto Toronto taxpayers while kids pay the ultimate price. Like its associates in other municipalities, the City of Toronto must urge the Province of Ontario to ensure that all children have permanent and mandatory access to the basic necessities of life. Thank you.
Councillor Carroll has a question. Thank you for the deputation.
Yes, thank you for coming. You're from the legal clinic in my neighborhood that is itself facing cuts as the other legal clinics are. So I thank you for coming at this time. In our discussions leading up to this meeting, you've indicated, while you welcome the request in this to ask the federal government, the provincial government to restore, not cut this permanently at the end of the year, but to restore the transition child benefit, there's a bit of a risk there. You have placed an emphasis on the real logical funder for this needs to be the province.
Yeah, that's true. I would agree that the federal government needs to change the eligibility for the Canada Child Benefit, and that's the role that they should play in this. But that's not the solution to this problem for two reasons. One of them is that this tax system is simply not responsive. It's a yearly analysis of people's eligibility, and on top of that, if there is an issue, decisions take a long time. There's no such thing as interim assistance in the tax system. You have to go to tax court to fight something like an audit decision, and so there's no benefit. There's no benefits to people in the meantime. The second reason, though, is that fundamentally this is a social assistance issue. The province is obliged to provide social assistance to children, and Canada Child Benefit eligibility doesn't absolve the province of that issue. Historically, the province actually provided social assistance through, provided this benefit through the social assistance system, and it was actually removed and put into the tax system in order to broaden eligibility to low-income earners. And the TCB was created in recognition that not all residents of Ontario would be able to access the child tax benefit. So they're actually meant to work together. The transition child benefit isn't something separate from the Canada Child Benefit. It's an integrated system.
Right. And just one other question, Mr. Mayor. You're also concerned, and I'll ask this question of staff, but I just found out yesterday, you're also concerned in changing this to what we're calling a temporary housing allowance. You're worried about some of the other things that families in crisis, particularly refugee hotel residents, use the benefit for in the interim, don't appear to apply to the temporary housing benefit.
Right. So the transition child benefit is meant for the basic necessities of children, and that's what people are using it for. That could include buying food for the children, buying winter boots as the winter season's coming up. And so it's not only a shelter benefit, although definitely, given how expensive housing costs are in Toronto, a lot of the money is spent on shelter.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor Carroll. Any other questions of the deputy? Okay. Well, thank you very much for being here, and thank you for your deputation and for answering the questions. And that would bring us next to any questions there are of staff.
That's already a recommendation in the report.
Councillor Deputy Mayor Thompson. I'm sorry. Were you?
Sorry, he was just asking me to review the motion. I did want to speak.
No, we're not there yet. We're at questions
okay,
of staff.
good.
So
Okay,
but you would go first on that if you had any of those.
Yeah, I do have questions.
Oh, fine, then why don't you, and then we'll
Yeah.
come back. Thanks.
About the deputy's concern, we're changing it to call it a temporary housing benefit, because the analysis shows that's the biggest use of the dollars, particularly if someone is ready to move out of the hotel, or some of the folks whose circumstances change faster than the tax system can recognize. A lot of it sometimes just keeps them in their house. But if someone is made eligible for this during the 6 months that we're going to be able to offer this, is it understood that they can spend it on the basic necessities of raising a child that are not housing?
Through the chair, this proposal is not meant to replace TCB. It is trying to address the issue that these individuals made housing decisions based on the amount of income that they had at that time. We worked very hard to get them housed and out of the shelter system. So we have a group of individuals that are now in housing that they will no longer be able to afford and at risk of being dehoused, and therefore will bounce back to the shelter system. So it's an intersecting issue.
Right.
In order to replace the TCB, it would cost the City of Toronto $22 million a year, something that obviously we cannot continue. So this is simply to address that issue of how the people that are receiving TCB today that will be dehoused and putting additional pressure on the shelter system.
So what is the plan? For instance, again, it only represents 35 to 40% depending on the week or month. For instance, families who are refugee, they may be placed in one of our hotels, and they're waiting to be eligible for the full Canada eligibility fund. Some are, through their sponsorships and such, ready to move into housing, and so if they're getting the TCB, or we're getting the TCB, often it gets used for housing. It can sometimes be, form some of their first and last month's rent and get them in there. But if they need that benefit just to sustain those kids, but they're not ready to move out of the hotel, are we saying that this temporary housing benefit would not then flow to them, nor would the TCB they've been receiving up until now?
The benefit will not provide their basic needs, really. I think the parents, the individuals decided that the most basic of needs is housing.
Right.
So they made that investment in housing for the children.
So is there, I'm sorry to belabor this, but so is there some other social measure that you're planning for those in the situation I just described? What will they do when the TCB just disappears, but they're not yet eligible? It's not a housing need they have, it's diapers, it's food, it's that. I've never experienced winter before and I suddenly have to buy outerwear for 3 kids. What do they do about that?
Through the chair,
I want to clarify that this was never intended to totally replace the child benefit.
Right, that's why I'm asking, I get the housing allowance now. What other thing are we doing for the people in the situation I just described?
We will continue to discuss with the province the importance of having a similar benefit to take care of these other needs. My concern would be if we fully step in and replace this provincial responsibility, it's going to be a bit of a challenge. So we're hoping to keep people housed and help them continue to find affordable housing for them with this reduced benefit, but we will be working with our intergovernmental office to have discussions with the province on the feds on how to replace or make up this difference, because it is, you're correct, there is a need out there, but our emphasis is going to be working with the provincial and federal government to try and address that gap. In the meantime, we do want to make sure that we can stabilize housing for these families over the next 6 months.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your perseverance through my questioning. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Carroll. Are there other questions of staff? Councillor, Deputy Mayor Thompson, yes.
Thank you very much. How many families are in question?
About 4,700 families would be impacted.
Right. And so if we were not to take some action, and I'll call this sort of a transition period, what then would be the ultimate impact on families and on our load, if you will?
So what we have covered through the chair, what we have covered in the report is what will happen if approximately 20 to 30 or 50% of those families become dehoused and bounce back to the shelter system. So by making this investment of $8.4 million, we would save money that we might have to use for shelter. So it's an offsetting investment, because we feel that the cost of the shelter system would be something that we could not sustain, never mind that we don't have capacity in general.
Right. And just, I realize the question for staff, but Mr. Mayor, if I can ask you a question. What steps will you be taking to address this particular issue, both with the province and the federal government? Because I think the federal government does have some responsibility with this issue, irrespective of the province's position in terms of cutting the contributions that they're making.
I'm going to embark on advocacy with both governments because I believe, and I'll address myself in my own remarks later on to this, I believe, I think we've seen actually some very helpful and positive signs from the current government of Canada that they acknowledge that when it comes to the issue, for example, of housing and shelter for refugees, that they have some responsibility there. And so I'm hopeful the same will be extended to actually helping people to stay in housing that we've helped arrange in many cases for those recipients of the child benefit. And I'm hopeful that the province will recognize the fact that this really is just putting an unfair burden onto us, because we're the one level of government that can't sort of just ignore when someone shows up and knocks on the door of the shelter with children in tow. And so I will be embarking on a very vigorous campaign of advocacy on behalf of all members of council, and hopefully joined by those who wish to join me in trying to get both governments to take some responsibility for this, because the one level of government that's least equipped to do it financially is us. But in the meantime, we have an obligation, as we do so many times, to step up and do something so we don't have people that end up literally on the street.
Thank you.
Other questions of staff? Okay, well then we would move to speakers on this item, and Councillor Carroll would be first.
Thank you. I'm being a bit of a nuisance this morning. I'm going to be asking Councillor Ainsley to add a recommendation. I think you heard from the deputant that came from the Willowdale Legal Clinic that it's welcome that one of the recommendations here, while we're setting up this temporary solution, that the mayor does embark and staff embark on a robust campaign to try and get them to restore this child benefit. But I think the discussion kind of, and the analysis that staff have done sort of displays the danger that was in this thing all along. This was a very flexible sort of benefit that was allowed, that really temporarily addresses changing circumstances. And when you're dealing with something that is not, this is not something, a benefit that you go on and you stay on and becomes generational within a poverty family. It addresses a certain circumstance until you become eligible for what is permanently available. So it's not that hard to deliver, if only the province would want to continue to do so, because we're nimble enough to be able to tell them who needs it and when. So to lobby them vigorously not to eliminate it or to restore it, as the recommendation asks, is very very helpful. But I'm asking that Executive Committee and Council support an additional recommendation that the province, who is the natural person to deal with this, you look for the sweeping national programs in the federal government. They create equity and poverty elimination across the country. But a province can be a little more nimble and address those social situations that arise. A municipality can be extremely nimble and has the resources on the ground to be able to target those resources for the province. And so I think while we're going through this difficult phase with our partners at the province, we've got to continue to keep the eye on who should be doing what and recommend it. So while we make these recommendations, could the feds or the province do something? I think it's important to point the way to the province. You should look at what we just found out. In the main, this money tends to go to housing, and so we're looking at a temporary stopgap here that we're calling a temporary family housing benefit, because that's the biggest thing this money gets spent on. Maybe that's the thing that should exist. And so I'm asking that we add a recommendation that the government look at adopting this temporary housing benefit that we're going to agree as council to fund for 6 months as something that they ought to permanently be delivering. Because this is wealth redistribution at its purest. And so it should be coming from an income tax, and it should be coming from the most localized income tax, that being provincial. So I welcome all the recommendations in here. I'm so grateful that staff have found this solution, because there are users for this in spades in Ward 17. But I just wanted to add that City Council also requests the Government of Ontario specifically adopt the temporary family housing benefit as a permanent provincially funded program to provide that continued support, so that they look at our solution as perhaps that's the thing you should have been delivering all along. And Councillor Ainsley will move it for me, and I'm grateful for that.
Thank you, Councillor Carroll. Others wishing to speak? Okay, well, I'm just going to say a few words if I might. I'm sorry, what do we have here? Oh, yes, I have a motion here that City Council requests the federal and provincial governments to immediately fund the transition child benefit to prevent increased pressure on Toronto's shelter system. So it's really just asking this province to restore some participation and asking the federal government if they might come in, and I'll address myself to that as I go through. I look at this and say, well, if you know, what is the impact going to be? And we've seen in the report, and we've heard answered questions today, that the impact is going to be hundreds of dollars, for example, on a family that has 3 children. And we know from the report, we just know from our own experience with this, there are 2 principal groups that will be affected by this. The one is refugee families and asylum claimants, and the other is a group of people who are in a sort of a transitional phase where they've lost jobs and they apply for social assistance. And I think if you look at those groups and look sort of down below the top level and see the housing that they're in, which in many cases we help them to arrange through Streets to Homes, through all the different efforts that we make, and we've had quite a bit of success actually in housing you know, refugee families as the flow of refugees has continued to come to Toronto. We see that those are the groups who are going to be affected by this, and we would know, just as a matter of self-evident you know, information, that if you remove $230 or $460 or $690 or any amount bigger than that from families like that, that by definition are going to be in housing that was hard fought to get and that is probably difficult for them to continue to afford, as it is with that money, that if they lose that money, the ability that they will have to stay in that housing will be at least severely jeopardized. And we know that 2 things happen then if they lose that housing. First of all, they need housing, so they lose their housing. But secondly, we know another reality of all this, which is what irritates me the most about these steps taken by the Government of Ontario, which is that they end up on our doorstep. Once again, the City of Toronto or other cities in this province, because it isn't confined to us, but we're here dealing with our own affairs, the City of Toronto is left because we are the one level of government that cannot sort of fail to answer a knock on the door when it comes at the door of one of our shelters or one of our offices, constituency offices, from people who have lost their housing because they don't have the money to pay and need a place to live all year, but especially when it comes to the season that's now soon to be upon us, which is the winter. And I will tell you that I'm frustrated, I'm exhausted with this continuous pattern of behavior where the provincial government abdicates a field, knowing as they do where the responsibility ends up when they do so, because they know, or if they don't know, then they're acting irresponsibly, that these are benefits that are flowing to human beings who are using it to pay for their housing. So they should ask the question before they do away with a transitional benefit, well, how is this going to affect people and where are they going to end up? And they know where they end up. They end up with us. They end up knocking on our door. They end up with the level of government that is right here, right now in Toronto. It's us, because we're here. It's our city we're responsible for. And I can take the time, and I won't take much, to be critical of the federal government in that a big part of this problem is the time that is being taken to adjudicate on the claims of those who are seeking asylum or who are claiming refugee status in this country. There are people who describe those people as illegal immigrants, and you learn on first day of law school, and those who don't even go to law school can easily figure out the fact that under our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, you are entitled when you come here to either claim asylum or refugee status to due process. That's something we believe in as Canadians. And so it means, first of all, you are not illegal immigrants. You are people whose status needs to be resolved. And there is some criticism to be levied at the federal government for the fact that that adjudication is taking so long, thus creating the need for people to have housing on a longer-term basis than we might have expected. And that is something I've talked about before, but I think for those who mislead and who polarize by talking about these as illegal immigrants, and I think furthermore use it as a reason somehow why they can abdicate this field and leave people, human beings, that are here seeking due process and going through due process, it just doesn't provide any basis at all as to why this benefit should be or can be removed for this group of people, especially when it has the effect of causing them to lose their housing. And so it is why, notwithstanding, and I'm not happy at the fact that yet again we have to step up, because we cannot look these people in the eye, we cannot open the door and find them standing there and say no, and so sorry about that, there just is no money for you for your housing. We are better off to keep them in the housing that they're in, while we embark on a vigorous campaign of advocacy to both of the other governments. And it's why I will vote for Councillor Carroll's motion on the basis that it suggests something the province should do, but I'll also vote for my own, obviously, that says we have to advocate to both the governments, because I would find it quite an acceptable outcome if both of those governments took some responsibility for something that surely should not be laid solely at the doorstep of city taxpayers and property taxes. We're doing it because it actually, if you don't believe the moral case of leaving people in their housing, then there is a business case that says if we just let those people show up at the shelters asking us for help, it'll cost us more money than this transitional benefit will cost for the next 6 months. But I don't like us stepping in to effectively fill shoes that are a gap that is created deliberately by a government that took a decision knowing what would end up happening here. So I hope people will support these motions and support the item itself, and join me in advocating to make sure we get a different result sooner than 6 months from now, but at the very latest, 6 months from now. Thank you for your indulgence on the extra 50 seconds. And if there's no other comments that people have to make, I apologize, Councillor Ainsley. You do indeed, so please go ahead.
I do have a motion moved for Councillor Carroll, if we can put it on the screen. I'm going to be supporting this motion. I'll be supporting Mayor Tory's motion. One of the things that I get asked about all the time, or more often than not, since this council was merged down to 24 councillors, was, are you saving money? You must be saving money and time. And generally now I say to people, you know what, we a smaller council and we spend more money. And we spend more money because the province keeps cutting and downloading on us. I had a town hall meeting the other night, Mayor Tory, and they were asking about the school permits going up in the school gym. They said the permit doubled, and they like, councillor, like, do something about it. And I said, well, there's a municipal budget and there's a school board budget. The school board is facing cuts by the province. They're trying to figure out how to make ends meet. They're raising permits. I had another comment about the breakfast clubs in the area. And I said, we actually put more and more money into breakfast clubs, a program that was originally mandated down on us by the provincial government, and the current government has made it even worse. And I said, similar to this cut, where we're bringing in another $8.4 million with the breakfast programs, I explained to the people in my town hall, I as a councillor cannot have children going to school hungry. I said it trickles right through the entire day to, if you go to school hungry, you don't study, you don't listen to the teacher. I have kids that they go hungry at lunchtime, and it trickles right through the entire system. You don't learn, you don't graduate, you don't go to college or university, you don't get a job. And if you don't get a job, it circles right back to us as a municipality, trying to find people housing and support benefits. And, you know, this is another perfect example of the current government costing our municipality more money. And I think it needs to stop. I think it's very important that we fill this gap, but it's another program that the provincial government should be running, not us as the municipal government. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Ainsley. Any other comments? Otherwise, I think we're ready to deal with the motions and with the item as amended, assuming, depending how we deal with those motions. So we have motion number 1, which is moved by me to ask both of these governments to fund a transitional child benefit to prevent increased pressure on us. And I'll call the question on that. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Then we have motion number 2, moved by Councillor Ainsley, to request the Government of Ontario to adopt the temporary family housing benefit as a permanent provincially funded program. And I'll call the question on that. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. And then we have the item as amended by these two motions. So I'll call the question on the amendment. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Okay, let's take stock. We're doing very well here. I don't know the next item that's coming up. I think Councillor Ainsley is 16, the Information and Technology Capital Plan. Do we have time to deal with that, do you think, before lunch? It's 15 minutes. Pardon me? No, not on this, no, but I'm just trying to think. I know we're moving along. I'm just asking if we could deal with 16 if there's time to deal with it before lunch. I don't think there's a deputation on that item.
Yep.
Oh, sure, because we have items to deal with on which there are deputations, but I was trying to figure out in 15 minutes we had left what we could get done so that we have less to do after lunch. We're definitely coming back after, well, I mean, in your hands. I mean, we could, if you thought we could we might be, I think, just looking at these things, we might be another hour, just because I think the item on the gun, the police, and so on will take a little while, because there are some deputations. So I'm just being realistic and saying it's going to be an hour. If you'd like to work through, I'm happy to do that myself, but,
I was going to suggest we finish the agenda, but you think it'll be another hour?
well, I think it'll be an hour, but that's only an hour. It's 1:15, it's not,
Yeah.
so are people amenable to that?
I'm
You have a meeting at lunchtime? I actually have a phone call as well myself, which I could have, but, so I think we'll take a lunch break. And in the executive committee, it's only an hour, so we'll be back at 1:30, and I think we can finish in less than an hour after that if we deal with 8:16 now, which we can.
Yes.
Okay.
So, Mayor Tory, I do have a motion to move that I've worked with the CIO, our deputy city manager, if I can put it on the screen, that the City Council requests the Chief Technology Officer information and technology in consultation with the City Clerk to include offices of members of council in the implementation of the city's cloud-first approach to modernize to more cloud services, including all productivity tools.
Okay. Did you want to speak to that?
Just briefly, this is just, as we're dragging the city into the 21st century, we have a number of tools that this part of the report actually speaks to the Auditor General and her email system, and it's just making better use of the technology that we're provided. I've had a good conversation already with the interim CIO, and I'd like to move forward on this.
Okay. Are there any questions of the mover? Otherwise, I'm quite prepared to put the question on the amendment here and then to approve the item as amended. So all those in favor of the amendment? Opposed? Carried. And then the item as amended, all those in favor? Opposed? Carried. That was easy. Maybe I'll just suggest, and I think I could cut down on my hour estimate, Councillor Nunziata, that we could also move to item 8.21. It was being held for a deputation. Miguel Avila Velarde, are you up on that? Are you wishing to depute on that? Okay, well then why don't you come up and do that now? We have time to do that before lunch, and it'll also mean you won't have to wait, because I don't think you're... Oh yes, you're up on the next item too, but you can come on it's 8.21, if the members of committee are willing to move to that item, because that will take, I think, a short time, and then we'll just have the one item left to deal with after lunch. So Miguel, please. This is 8.21, the items considered by the Accessibility Advisory Committee. Yeah.
Jennifer Pegliero, a journalist with the Toronto Star, has some good news to City Council how to implement and modify the ways we accommodate people in the City Hall. David Mesling, as you know, he's an activist, and he has spoken many times about the inconveniences people face when it comes to City Council. My displeasure started in December 5th, 2018. On December 5th, 2018, I was told that if I need to go to the washrooms, I need to get a key. I had to request access into the third floor City Council washrooms. As I protested this, the corporate security reviewed their rules and decided that no longer the washroom will be closed on the third floor City Council during City Council days. So I have received information that that situation has been resolved. But I continue pursuing, asking for special accommodations because, see, this is the situation, Mr. Tory. This is you coming to our neighbor, Regent Park. Here you are with your scooter. In that situation, you are vulnerable. Imagine yourself going to the third floor City Council, and you are a member. Listen, we changed our roles. I am him, and I am sitting at City Council, and I don't have to be screened by anybody. Look at yourself on the scooter. Imagine, put yourself in a situation where when you go to the washroom at third floor City Council, third floor, they ask you, you need to be screened every time you go into the washroom, to use the washroom. How absurd is that? Especially if you have diabetes. Diabetes require that you go 2-3 times to use the public services, the public washrooms. In my case, that's the point I tried to make with Josie Scully and all the members of her team of corporate security. They replied to me with an incredible solution. They asked me, Miguel, look, we got a solution for you. We're gonna give you a washroom card, a special washroom pass. You will have access to the third floor council if the lines are busy with the screening desk, the magic wand, you know, and the metal detector set up on the third floor. You know what, Mr. Mayor, going back to your picture here, you in that situation, I want you to understand how someone with disabilities has to protest. The consultations of the third floor city council security enhancements, they failed to communicate with the Disability and Access Committee. They failed to communicate with people of disability communities. And going back to the story of the Toronto Star, why don't we implement a better, friendly community access to city council, right? Going back to the story, why can't we improve it instead of creating barriers for accessibility with people's, like, I have been coming to 10 years to city council. I never have been offended so much by asking every time I go to the washroom, Miguel, you need to remove everything from your pockets. You have to empty everything in your bag. Up to 3 times I get screened. I have asked them, well, I'm talking about intelligent people. Why can't they just move the table, the screening station, and the metal detector so they can facilitate the flow of people? Or just grandfather me, because I've been coming to city council and I don't have any trouble in the city council chambers. I need to use the washrooms, but I've been asked time and time again. I had to, you know, it's awful when you have a disability to be screamed time and time again for just using a public washroom. I think we can do better. I think David's Mesling comments and suggestions for city council can improve the image. And hopefully this will save money, because we don't want to go to court to fight this. Really, Mr. Joe, put yourself in my shoes. Thank you. That's all I want to say.
Thank you very much, Miguel. Are there any questions of the deputant? Are there any questions of staff? Are there any comments?
I'll just move the recommendation.
All right, just before, I only want to say I will follow up on that. I have learned some lessons from being on the scooter for a period of time this summer, and when I had Danielle Kane in here, certainly one of the prevalent topics of conversation we had was about the washroom, because for a lot of people who are disabled, the washroom is a big issue, especially if you're away from home, obviously. And so, but I'll follow up and see if there's a more practical way in which we can deal with this. I do note from even your own presentation, it's very fair, you've acknowledged they tried by creating this card, which was an attempt to accommodate the fact that it didn't make sense to have somebody you know, not able to get in and out, but we'll look into that with them and see if there's a better way to do this. You know, they're constrained in terms of the space they have and the security requirements we now have, unfortunately, at City Hall, but that's the way it is. But thank you for the deputation. And I think Councillor Nunziata has moved the item, and so I'll call the question on that. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Now, we have, what do I see there, about 7 minutes? I think maybe what we should just do is just move ahead and have lunch, because we've got 2 deputations plus a discussion, I'm sure, because I know there are people that are going to be here to speak to the... Is he? Well, of course, you never know. He can show up at a given moment. But having said that, if he isn't here, then there's one. I have I could absent the chair. I noticed that we're sort of perilously close to losing quorum. I have a phone call with a minister, an important phone call at 12:30. It's just when it was scheduled, because we thought we'd be taking lunch. I'm amenable if there are enough people here to have you continue with the business. Otherwise, we can come back at 1:30, and I think we can finish this item and get it done now. And who is the person? Councillor Deputy Mayor Barlow. She's already left to go to whatever she had at lunch. So we've got 1, 2, 3. Okay, so do we think we can get that item done in half an hour, the item that has to do with the police and the related matters? Okay, let's go ahead then. And I'll just absent the chair in 2 minutes.
Can I just make a comment?
About-
Because, because we mentioned earlier that we were going to come back from lunch, and I believe that Councillor Carroll had an interest in that item, and she's left,
We
so.
could probably get her to come back.
Okay.
So why don't we,
Okay. I just-
Edward, if you could just see.
I'm just trying to
Councillor
be
Carroll,
nice.
Yes, well, I understand, to be considerate,
Trying to
because
be
she did
nice,
have an interest in it, and to get, huh? The police have left?
Yeah, because I thought they were.
Okay, I apologize. We'll have to come back then. The police have left too, and if there's any questions of them, they're not here. So we'll come back at 1:30, and we'll see you then, and we'll get this done, and I'm sure fairly quickly at that time. Thank you.